It is a truism oft referred to that Shakespeare's reluctant schoolboy would have no difficulty fitting into a lesson in most classrooms today. We still teach a largely medieval curriculum using methods he would immediately recognize. There's nothing wrong with that, you might say, and I would agree with you. Kids need to know stuff and they need a guide to help them on that journey. The problem is the kids who don't get it. As a recent IFS study has found, despite decades of policy focus and huge efforts by teachers and schools, the disadvantage gap is barely closing. So a better understanding of how children's brains actually work might stop us perpetually trying very hard to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So to today's conference. What's the place of educational neuroscience in teacher education? In England, the early professional development of teachers is framed first by the core content framework for initial teacher education, and then by the early career framework. The former focuses on memory in this context, and the latter on cognitive load theory. It is, I think, a great advance that teachers now receive better support in their education and early careers, certainly a lot better than I got in 1978. But both curricula present a very partial view of how children learn. This conference seeks to expand teachers' understanding of education in neuroscience and researchers' understandings of the early careers framework, and how maybe with better teacher education on education in neuroscience and its potential, we could have a significant impact on learning.
Pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much to Learnus for organising this, and also to Caroline Schott in particular for handling all your application to attend and organising everything. It's always appreciated. Caroline, many thanks. So, brief outline on what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to spend a little bit more time on Learnus's mission, and then I'm going to paint a vision for you about how that mission might be realised in an ideal world. I'm then going to bring us back a little bit more to reality about if that was to be our vision, where are we at? But I'm going to be upbeat today. I've worn my upbeat suit. I'm going to be more upbeat today and give you some reasons for optimism that we may be able to overcome those challenges and get closer to that vision. But I'm going to say that there are some gaps in the system, ways things aren't working. Say this is at a whole system level, the way we organise our research and education system. And in that context, I'm going to introduce you to the Building Impact Groups project that my research centre and Learnus together are currently raising funding for. Okay, so back to Learnus's mission. Just read it out again. So it embeds in your subconscious. Learnus is dedicated to bringing educators and researchers who specialise in the study of the brain, the mind, and behaviour together in order to use the insights gained from high-quality research to improve and enrich learning for all. Okay, so this is going to be my vision. Now, you may not agree with this vision. You may think things should go in a different direction, and that is why today has lots of discussion sessions. So at the end of my few words, you can put your hand up and disagree with me that this is the way we want to go, or raise those views in the discussion sessions. But this might be a possible vision about how one might deliver Learnus's mission, the point at which Learnus says, our job is done, we don't have to have any more meetings like this. So here's a vision that there is a continuous dialogue between educators and researchers. Now, Learnus's mission emphasises the translation aspect from research into educational practice. But of course the intention is that will be a dialogue, and if the system is working well, then a lot of what researchers are doing will be responding to the new classroom and educational challenges and the policy priorities in order to set their research agenda. In this ideal world, you wouldn't have educators and researchers in some sort of competition or juxtaposition or hierarchy or anything like that. That in a sense that the science of learning, cognitive sciences, educational neuroscience, that's a sort of research and development sector trying to come up with new possibilities, new approaches that the educators might want to include in their practice. And putting together evaluation evidence of what seems to work, what seems to be effective. So it's kind of a supporting role to teachers' practice. The teachers themselves, you might want some aspect in teacher education, teacher training about how learning works. And some research literacy in order to be able to judge when someone comes up and say, oh, you need to stop your lessons halfway through and have everyone pat themselves on the head. Is that likely to be effective or not? What's the evidence base? Something that let's say, immunizes them to fake news, if there's a version of that in education. And that wouldn't just be as part of initial training, but things change. There are new research findings. You would expect that will be updated through continuing professional development. As I said, classroom challenges and policy priorities should equally update research agendas. You don't just want, sure, there's a place for basic researchers to be in their ivory towers and think their blue sky thoughts, but you also want researchers to be looking at how their findings would be relevant to the education system. And what we really want in education is a sense of progress. Doesn't have to be fast, but an accumulation of, we want to be getting better, getting answers, gradually improving practice. That may not happen immediately, but you want a sense of direction that you're accumulating an evidence base, a deeper understanding about what works best for what kids in what contexts. And ideally, when we're looking at translation of innovation, of trying to take new research findings and see how they might work in the classroom, that innovation happens through discussion, through dialogue, through co-creation. It's not researchers going, oh, this might work in the classroom, and just throwing it out there and expecting teachers to adapt. So that will be a vision about how things might work when Learnus's mission is complete. And I think it's important, it's not a target for you to shoot at. This is a schematic of what is called ecological systems theory. And it's an idea that we need to understand if we're trying to raise educational outcomes, learning outcomes. We have to understand the kind of multiple nested constraints on how we can improve performance. And right at the middle, we have the individual level factors, a child's abilities, their motivation, their health, these kind of things. But there's no point just improving that if you're not also thinking about, well, what is the level of teacher skill? What's going on in the classroom? What's the classroom environment? What's the school policy? What are the teaching materials? So you need to make sure that you're focusing on those, and that sits within the context of society, thinking about what's going on in the family context, the cultural influences out there, what kids are doing with their mobile phones and so forth. All of these are additional constraints. And then right out, you can probably barely see it in the outer ring, that's right out at things like the education budget and the national curriculum and education policy. Governments deciding based on their democratic mandate, how much money do we put into education systems? How do we organize them? How much do we pay teachers? So, yes, I'm very interested in the brain and learning mechanisms in the brain, but we have to understand to progress in terms of improving learning outcomes, narrowing gaps between children, that there are multiple constraints in play. Okay, so that's the vision. Let's have a look at some current challenges. Okay, so I jumped over. Here's the Observer newspaper just from a couple of days ago. We're interested in saying, well, wouldn't it be good if teachers can have initial training, continuing professional development that will help them understand about mechanisms of learning, factors that will influence their educational outcomes. But you look here on the Observer, I don't know whether you can see at the back, now English classes hit by worsening teacher crisis. That if you've got not enough teachers, then you can't really be picky about making sure you've got a super long initial training for teachers, that there are these constraints about how you run the whole teaching system that it's like all hands to the pump. So maybe right now isn't the moment to think, wow, let's make them go away and do 5 years of theory before they hit the classroom. Richard mentioned the YouGov poll commissioned by Learnus, and as part of this, so this was like 1,000 teachers, isn't it? About over 1,000 teachers, representative sample, polled. We were interested in asking them, what do you know about educational neuroscience? Do you think it would be useful in your practice? But we also asked them, what are your current priorities? And so, number 1, workload. Number 2, funding cuts. Number 3, student behavior. So a lot of other things are much higher priority for teachers in the classroom, other than details about, how the basal ganglia talks to the hippocampus or something like that. So I'm going to quote a little bit from Professor Rob Coe, who's a senior associate at the Education Endowment Foundation, because I really like this. Came from a recent blog that Rob wrote. Because I think it does remind us a little bit about history and that we have made some progress, right? So he said, before 2011, if you did or advocated a randomized control trial in education, you were part of a marginalized tiny minority within the research community, struggling to get funding or even get work published in mainstream journals. Rob says, when I spoke to groups of teachers, it was always a hard sell to make the case that education research had anything to offer a classroom practitioner. If you tried to persuade them that something intuitively obvious, but actually in conflict with solid evidence about learning styles or the effect of class size, if you said that might be wrong, you pretty much lost the argument consistently. Now, fortunately, we have the Education Endowment Foundation. I've got a big green tick there. Excellent. I think it's important to realize how lucky we are to have that kind of organization, and that somehow a government thought it was a good idea to set up a separate endowed organization, independent of policy, to try and build the evidence base about what works in education. And I was in Paris the other week talking with French colleagues, and they have huge envy that we have something like the Education Endowment Foundation. And they would love to do something like systematic randomized control trials to build this evidence-based in education. It's something that they strive for. So we should realize how lucky we are that is pushing us towards building an evidence base, and it shows us that policymakers do have an interest in that. But still, if you look at Rob's blog, he said, yes, but Education Endowment Foundation's randomized control trials have typically evaluated manualized programs which require schools to purchase particular resources or training, rather than relating to the everyday choices that teachers have to make when planning their lessons and supporting their students. So it's not clear that the kind of RCTs that were being run actually speak to the relevance of what teachers are doing in the classroom. Okay, so a few more challenges. So we're lucky to have the Education Endowment Foundation to run RCTs, but almost we're getting a bit post-RCT. Whereas in France, they're pre-RCT. Here we're kind of a little bit over it. We're a little bit saying, yeah, but is that really the right way to evaluate what works? These large-scale, expensive trials where everything is held constant and you just vary one tiny thing, and typically you get small effect sizes, and what should be the right control group, and is that really embracing the context of how important the actual classroom and the actual teachers are, and these kind of issues. So we're having that kind of debate now about, and not that we shouldn't run RCTs, but do they need to be complemented by other sorts of evaluations as well? A lot of what we're going to talk about today is the challenge of historically a lack of theory in teacher training and teacher education. So theory about cognitive development, about how learning works, of what good evidence is. And although we do have a fantastic research base in this country. That research base has not always been used to innovate effectively or in a form that teachers either can or want to use in the classroom. And that's partly due to the lack of having a proper dialogue between researchers and educators, and the fact that the activities that you're coming up with inspired by research findings are not co-created with teachers. And all of that means that where translation has happened between research and practice, there are some success stories, right? But they seem a little bit haphazard and like piecemeal. So good luck when that happens. It's not really systematic. Okay, so I'm going to try and be upbeat, pose some challenges. Let's have some reasons for optimism. So the first thing is, that's my poor schematic of a pendulum. It's a metaphor, everyone. We're on metaphorical grounds here. Thinking about how you organize your teacher education and these extreme poles of viewing it either as an apprenticeship at one end, that really this is something you learn on the job. And the extreme version is, well, you've got some undergraduate degree or something, I'm sure you'll be very good, but here's the curriculum and some lesson plans, just get in there and learn on the job. That's one end. And then the extreme end of other end of the pendulum swing is it's got to be really theoretical. So no, don't even think about going near the classroom until you've at least completed a sort of master's degree in some kind of educational topic. Now, in this country, we have sort of been at the left-hand end of that, of viewing teaching as more as an apprenticeship, of minimal kind of theoretical training, and more about learning on the job and being mentored on the job by more experienced colleagues. But the grounds for optimism, pendulums, presumably in this metaphor, are always best when they're hanging down vertically. Or somewhere in the middle, right? And we are coming back in this country a little bit from the left-hand end, the apprenticeship model, a little bit more towards theory. I don't really know where the ideal place for the pendulum is. Some people would argue that in Finland, they have for a while that was held up as the ideal system. In there, every teacher needs to get a master's degree, right? So they have a view that you need to be perhaps a little bit more to the right. So, grounds for optimism is that in 2019, the early career framework was introduced, laying out kind of the topics and the skills that government thought teachers should have. So, early career framework is for developing those skills early in your career, but it also synthesizes with the initial teacher training core content framework. And the exciting thing from my point of view is there is some theory about how learning works in this document. So it's going to be tiny for you to read at the back, but number one is how pupils learn. Standard 2, promote good progress. And trainee teachers, developing teachers need to know that learning involves a lasting change in pupils' capabilities or understanding. It's not what neuroscientists think learning is, but that's another story for another day. But let's just focus on 3 and 4 here. An important factor in learning is memory, which can be thought of as comprising 2 elements, working memory and long-term memory. Working memory is where information that is being actively processed is held, but its capacity is limited and can be overloaded. And in this document, there's a distinction between learning that information and then skills learning how to as a consequence. Things like avoid overloading working memory by taking into account pupils' prior knowledge when planning how much new information introduce, breaking complex material into smaller steps, and so on. Now, today, we're going to have a session this afternoon hearing more about how one implements the early career framework in training, and I'm really looking forward to that session. So that's promising, right? The idea that you can put some research-informed evidence into teacher education. Promising, although you can all say it should have been better, right? So I'm glad that is in there. But the content in that document is actually not from cognitive scientists. And if you go to the end of the document in the acknowledgements, who was on the advisory group, Turns out no one there has a cognitive science training, that they are educators, education theorists. And it turns out that that content is actually based on a 1980s instructional design theory promoted by educational researchers called cognitive load theory, John Sweller and his colleagues. So not ideal, but promising. Cognitive load theory, so I put it in scare quotes because for me it's not a cognitive theory, but there are bits of it that are good, right? So it's kind of based on this 1980s static metaphor that like knowledge comes in blocks. So in the student's mind, there's long-term memory. That's your old knowledge, a big block, right? Bits of it can be weak, then you get misconceptions, but you get a big block of old knowledge. And the teacher's job, through instruction, is to force new knowledge through the bottleneck of working memory, which has a limited capacity, and get it into old knowledge. And there's that teacher struggling, going, maybe I should break it into smaller chunks to get it through the bottleneck. So some of these bits are right. Okay, I mean, if you look at that cognitive load theory, I mean, they do emphasize things like retrieval practice and so forth. Promising parts to it, but not a proper cognitive science theory. Now, we're going to hear in sessions later today from Paul Howard-Jones and Kendra McMahon, and also from Duncan Astle, what else you might put into there to improve the representation of what we know from the science of learning about how learning works. So, for example, in the next edition of the Early Careers Framework document, you may want to add things about executive function skills, things like attention, inhibiting, maintaining, and shifting, which don't figure in cognitive load theory, and the fact that those executive function skills actually change with age, and the fact that children's knowledge structures actually change with age. So that gives a clue that cognitive load theory isn't actually a developmental theory. Things don't change with age in cognitive load theory, but we know they do in reality. And that's one thing we know about children, right? They develop, they're changing as they go through school, so you need to build that into your understanding of learning. Cognitive load theory is an instructional theory, and it emphasizes instruction and the teacher's role in pushing that knowledge in. But we know that children are actually active seekers of knowledge, not passive recipients. And so one needs to think about discovery learning as well being an important aspect. Cognitive load theory doesn't talk about emotions. We now know that emotions are really important for learning. Curiosity, good. Anxiety, bad. We know that social context, a big social brain in there, social context is important. Peer learning, good. Peer distraction, bad. And we know that bottle goes through adolescence at some point, right? And we know things happen in adolescence. Peer approval becomes more important. It's more risk-taking. Adolescents more vulnerable to mental health concerns. But their metacognitive skills are improving, understanding about their own learning and their own state of knowledge. And all of that stuff differs between children. Okay. So, good, optimistic that we've got some kind of cognitive science into kind of the curriculum for teacher training, but could do a little better there. Other reasons for optimism, I think, maybe it's just me, I think researchers are getting a little bit better at communicating what are the important parts from research that are going to be relevant to educators. And part of that is through more events like this, and activities and workshops and dissemination and social media, building online resources and publishing policy briefs of getting across what parts of that basic research are relevant. Teachers shouldn't be reading neuroscience, science papers, right? Not going to help in practice. So we do need communicators to get across what we think are the relevant parts, if only to debunk some of the myths that are out there. So you'll see there's a book which you may have on your table, and the lead author, Kathy Rogers, is in the room. and happy to sign copies of your book. I've also put a lovely diagram that is one of my favorites from a book chapter by Paul Howard-Jones. Maybe Paul will talk more about this later, about taking all that stuff that the brain does and simplifying it down into the cycles of learning of engage, build knowledge, consolidate knowledge. Okay, and yeah, there are brain areas that are doing that, but you need to be able to turn that in a kind of a practical heuristic for teachers. Up here is a policy brief that was put together by Duncan Astle's group, looking at diversity and inclusion. And Neuroscience, this is a project trying to take what we understand from basic research on neurodevelopmental conditions and pull apart the key features of different types of conditions and how those might be relevant in the classroom. Okay. I talked about the YouGov poll that Learnus commissioned, and I said, it's apparent teachers have more pressing priorities at the moment, but also that YouGov poll did find some promising aspects. So the majority of teachers were, when asked, open to education on neuroscience. I mean, they had some caveats. They said, look, as long as its concrete application in the classroom can be explained, as long as that's fitted into training and CPD without increasing workload. And in fact, here's a quote from the report. The majority, 76% of those who are aware of educational neuroscience have found its insights useful in their teaching. The majority also agree that it is relevant to their professional development, and over half believe it would be possible to implement in their classroom. A smaller proportion, 39%, feel that it underpins the future of teaching. Okay, so I quoted from Rob Coe's blog, but I didn't give you the punchline. The point of that blog was that the Education Endowment Foundation have understood that previous RCTs may not have had the best relevance, the maximal relevance for teachers in the classroom. And so they have innovated there and launched their teacher choices trials, where evaluations are set up and driven by actual concerns of teachers in the classroom, the kind of everyday choices they need to make. I'm actually working on one of these projects at the moment about how should teachers use worked examples, in what context? Should they just show correct examples or incorrect examples or some mix? Or does that matter on the level of attainment of the pupils? If you're just starting off, do you just want correct examples? These kind of questions, which are not overarching, what should a phonics intervention look like, but much more about the micro decisions in everyday practice. So I think that that is grounds for optimism, grounds that we're making progress. So to finish, I'm going to say that I still think some gaps exist in the system, why it's not working optimally. And part of that is to do with how we set up funding. So most of the funding for research and evaluation is coming from the government, some of it from charitable trusts, but that funding either goes to basic research or it goes to evaluation. Now, if we want to get from basic research to use that research to generate the new ideas to evaluate, we need some process of innovation. But there's no funding for that innovation in this area. There are no structures to deliver it. Now, fantastic organizations like Learnus are trying to get this to happen. That's why you're all in the room, right? But this is not a government-driven, system-wide approach to make things happen, which is slightly odd because government's quite happy to fund innovation in the business sector. And it's quite accepted, say these are catapult centers for driving innovation in different areas. Often it's a business thing, so you identify a market need, and then you get the relevant expertise together in a room. It's not a hierarchy of who's better and who's worse. It's how do we crack this problem? How can we combine our expertise to innovate? So that was our inspiration behind developing the big project building impact groups, is to try and think about, well, can we put together a project that tries effectively to come up with innovation hubs for translation in education. And it's you've got the pamphlet in front of you, so I won't go through the details, but the idea is to to have a steering group to take an overview about what are the representative set of areas where we want to drive innovation. Yes, we might have the traditional ones like reading and spelling or handwriting or numeracy, but also we might think about brain health or technology use or giftedness or creativity or good citizenship. And then you convene focus groups of leading researchers in that area and of invested educators, and we're going to have some lovely discussions today. We're going to go out very enthusiastic about what a great idea it is at the end of the day. But, I don't know, you can do an audit at the end. There are going to be some pads of paper with some scribbles on. But will there be any concrete product from today? Possibly, if we're lucky. Depends on how hard learners work afterwards to write up the materials and generate a report, but who's going to read the report, right? So this is the challenge we have in this area, but you need to do this properly. And it's not rocket science. You just have to run these focus groups properly so that they are timed, product-oriented, outcome-oriented. So the idea here is minimally, we get the teachers to identify 3 things about what the researchers are talking about that might potentially be developed into new activities in the classroom. And we get the researchers to take 3 things from what the teachers say it's like in that area, say, getting 6-year-olds to pay attention in class. 3 challenges that researchers could go away and purpose their research agendas to investigate. And you do this systematically across a set of areas. You've then generated, well, apart from establishing a new translation network, you've got a new roadmap for research, and you've got, say, if you've got 20 focus groups, you've got 60 new ideas to build pilot studies, feasibility studies, to develop, to co-create with teachers. So I don't know whether this is the right scheme, but it just seems to me that this is something that is missing, that we have the potential to innovate, but we're not investing in the process of innovation or its supporting infrastructure. Okay, so that's everything I have to say this morning. I'm looking forward to all the activities, hearing about research going into early careers training, and actually how the early careers framework is implemented this afternoon. Thanks for your attention.
Next session, Place of Educational Neuroscience in Teacher Education. It's going to be a joint presentation by Professor Paul Howard-Jones of the University of Bristol and Dr. Kendra McMahon, Bath Spa University.
I'm not aware that other universities other than ours are actually incorporating educational neuroscience in teacher education, but please tell me if that's not true, because I'd love we'd love to join up with you. So that's why we've come here today, but Kendra's going to lead off now and tell you a little bit about Bath Spa University and what they're doing there, and then I'll be coming in a little bit later and also telling you a little bit about some of the new research that I'm working on at the moment in this area.
As Paul was saying, we, as Bath Spa University, we kind of got into this about 6 or 7 years ago because we recognised there was this kind of global push to consider educational neuroscience, to consider the place of brain-based research in education. We were very much aware there were lots of publications coming out, lots of wonderful books about it. Some of these books weren't out at the time, but they very much are now, so we thought we'd put in some more recent images too. And we just realised that we really needed to get a grip of this and think about what it might mean for us in teacher education. And we also realised, and this echoes some conversations we had on my table earlier, that our expertise only went so far and that we couldn't do it on our own. We needed to talk to other colleagues. And so we worked with colleagues in the School of Psychology, particularly a colleague called Pete Etchells, who's a biological psychologist. He's better known these days for his work on video games and taking a critical approach to some of the publicity around their negative effects. Alison Lee, who's a clinical, I get this right, social neuropsychologist, along with colleagues Kerry-Ann Barber, who's here with us today, Darren McKay, and others from the PGCE programs. So nobody could do it on their own. We really had to collaborate and think together about this and pool our expertise. I think particularly at the beginning we were quite concerned that we didn't introduce any new neuromyths, any new misunderstandings, misconceptions, and we wanted to think about doing this in a way that kind of got it as right as we could. The approach that we were taking is based on something called design-based research, and I think this offers quite an interesting alternative to the kind of RCT type ways of doing research. So Michael was saying there's a need for some different forms. I think this is one of the different forms that is out there. And it's really about trial and error, iterations of designing resources, working with them, with practitioners, seeing what happens, seeing what the outcomes are, improving them. So the outputs are kind of twofold. There's the actual interventions, the materials that you design, and then there's also some principles, some understandings about why some things might work better than others. So those were the approaches that we were taking. And we really wanted, we started off with a big intention that we wanted our new teachers to be very much critical consumers of neuroscience. That was our start point. So we recognised there was this kind of history of issues where teachers had perhaps misunderstood parts of the science and misused them, things like brain gym. We were concerned we weren't going to replicate those kinds of things. We wanted to address neuromyths where we knew that they existed. And also, as part of our general aim for the kinds of teachers we wanted to produce, we want teachers who are critical thinking, who understand the place of research, and who aren't just kind of technicians doing as they're told. We want people who can think for themselves. So our approach was kind of twofold, really. We did a bit of introduction of some ideas about the brain and learning. And we've also had some seminars where we took particular brain-based claims. So I've got some examples of some up here, such as the sort of classic learning styles neuromyth about children should be taught in their preferred learning style. So that was one that we've addressed. What else? The kind of left brain, right brain, thinking, I'm creative, I'm a right brain thinker. But we also put in some which were perhaps more robust, but also needed a bit of thinking about in critical terms as well, about, for example, the growth mindset and retrieval practice, where we really wanted our trainee teachers to dig a bit more into some of the ideas and the evidence and the limitations behind the claims as well. The actual way we've done it has really developed over the years, and I think the most recent versions, anyway, you can ask my colleagues about the most up-to-date versions, but this is kind of the basis for some of it. So did any of it work? Well, what we did manage to do was, I would say, unsettle their beliefs. So we did a kind of pre and post survey. And there was a shift, so overall there were less trainee teachers holding neuromyths. But the shift was mostly because they were a bit more uncertain, unsure. I'm actually quite happy with that as an outcome in many ways. I think that sort of sense of wondering and not being so sure about what the evidence is telling you and how it fits with your own experiences and previous ideas, that was a kind of good enough interim state, I think, for now. But it's not the full story, and more is needed. And then the early career framework and the ITT core content framework kind of arrived as we were doing all of this. And because, as Michael explained earlier, these are statutory kind of curriculum documents almost. So for initial teacher education, it's a bit like a national curriculum. This is what you have to do. It's set out as a minimum, but in practice, because of the limited amount of time available, it really dominates what happens in a programme. And you have to have teams that are working really hard and thinking very carefully to integrate their own ideas and thoughts alongside this, which is what we tried to do. I've put that picture up, which I think will be familiar particularly to teachers, but perhaps to everyone else, which is, I think, the dominant view of learning that comes through in the ITT core content framework. And my understanding of how some of this came to be and how it came to be in the form that it's in is quite a bit of it was influenced by the work of the American group Deans for Impact, and also Dan Willingham, who was part of that group but has also done a lot of writing himself. And he's written some really quite interesting articles about what he thinks should be in initial teacher education. And there's quite a lot of resonance between what he's written and what we've got. So I thought it'd be interesting just to explore a few of his ideas briefly. So he was saying, what are we going to do with science that might help teachers, might help education? And he said, yes, we can kind of test programs and look at those. And the other proposal he had was that we should produce some what he called empirical generalizations, basically kind of the emergent claims from science, ones that are relevant to practice around children's thinking, their emotions, their motivations. And we should set out, perhaps not the framework, perhaps not all the science behind them, but we should just give teachers those endpoints, the empirical generalizations. And I think that's pretty much what we've got, is a list of empirical generalizations. He also argued really strongly that there should be a really quite minimal amount of theories of learning introduced to teachers. And he took a rather critical view of the dominant model at the time, which was really kind of a potted history of psychology. You think about behaviourist approaches, you think about Piagetian constructivism, and then you move into talking about social constructivist, perhaps sociocultural ideas. I'm going to come back to those. And he said, well, that's just overwhelming and too much, and most of it's old, and why are we doing this, really? Should we just have one simple, clear theory that teachers could engage with? Again, I think some of that thinking might be behind what we've ended up with. So, to look at this in a bit more depth then, Michael showed you something similar before. So we've got the kind of statements that our trainee teachers have got to learn, statements that they're supposed to get, to understand through their initial teacher education, and then sort of actually putting things into practice, things that they're supposed to be able to do in practice. For example, this one up here, regular purposeful practice of what has previously been taught can help consolidate material and help pupils remember what they've learned. I actually think one of the useful things that this framework has done is make us think a bit more carefully about the consolidation of learning. I think that was a kind of a gap, a missing part in how we talked about learning before, actually, that has been a really helpful addition. But I think it's also a nice example of how putting this into practice is really quite challenging. So you can take that empirical generalisation, that statement, what are you supposed to do with it? And it was really good to see that expert colleagues, teachers, were being valued, and that their kind of nuanced understanding of complexity and how to make things work in practice was being valued. But I think it's still quite a big ask of the school-based mentors to do that translation. I think in practice what's happening is a lot of the university educators are working with mentors, with students, to try and imagine what these statements might look like in practice. Quite a challenging thing to do, I think. And particularly challenging if what you've got are kind of statements without any real understanding of why this should be. What's the kind of mechanism behind this? I think that's quite puzzling for people to then work out where does this fit in the complex realities of a classroom. And this is where we think bringing in the neuroscience perspective alongside the one that has to be there, the more memory-based view of learning. We think this has been really helpful because, first of all, it gives you this kind of concrete idea, perhaps, that what learning is about is making connections between neurons, so we can kind of visualise that. Oops, dropping things. I'll leave them there. They can't fall off the floor. It gives our kind of tutors as well, actually, but also our trainees, this concrete idea, what might be going on. Oh, right, we're trying to make these connections, we're trying to strengthen these connections, this is what might actually be going on. And also we've tried to introduce images such as this one from the Human Connectome project, to help them see the brain not as kind of separate boxes, because I think one of the problems with the kind of working memory to long-term memory view is it does look a bit like it's all happening in kind of separate boxes, to try and challenge that and say, well, we're talking about connections really between different parts of the brain. This might help you make a bit more sense of how the emotions might be involved with the thinking and how it all entwines together. So we thought different models were quite helpful. And it is always hard to know how far to take it and what level of depth of understanding trainees can cope with in quite a short programme. But this seemed to be a kind of key useful concept. I'm going to go back briefly to these multiple views of learning that I talked about, because one of the challenges for introducing, of course, anything new on any programme is that there are existing ways of doing things, existing understandings. We talk about people who are actually having to implement these new ideas, and they're coming with their own beliefs and paradigms that they've been working with. And of course, they can see what's valuable about them and what they don't want to let go of. And I think there are some valuable things in these paradigms that I think have been lost in the core content framework that we're really trying to hang on to, actually, in initial teacher education. So the behaviour is often introduced almost as a kind of straw man to say, yeah, we've got a bit of a view of Ferreira called a banking model. We're just kind of pushing stuff in, a bit like that bottle analogy that Michael gave earlier. And it was trying to challenge that, saying, yeah, well, should we actually think about what's going on inside the learner's mind as well? That shift to a more Piagetian idea. Shall we think about what's happening inside as well, what's happening in the mind of the learner? And although there's a bit of a gap now, because Piagetian developmental theory has been understood to be not a good representation of what's really going on, that sort of stage theory, I think there's a bit of a gap there now, as you said, about thinking about how we talk about development. But we do still talk about Piaget in terms of the learner being an active person who's really constructing their own ideas through engagement and through physical engagement with the world. And thinking about our work as primary and early years practitioners, that interaction that's actually hands-on is really an important part of it. And that doesn't appear anywhere in the core content framework. So that's an omission, we think. So that's one of the reasons, again, we're hanging on to a bit of that perspective. And the ideas from social constructivism and sociocultural theory, largely drawn on the work of people like Jerome Bruner, but of course, Russian Lev Vygotsky. We think not just about the individual's mind, but also about the minds of the teacher, the other people around them. And there's so much research and theory and a really rich understanding of what's happening between people through talk, through classroom interactions of all different kinds, and actually quite reluctant to let go some of the insights and understandings that come from that. So hanging on to that sense that actually the talk, the communication, the use of symbols to mediate learning, all of those ideas are really important as well. And again, fairly limited representation in the core content framework. Talk is mentioned, but it gets quite a small space. And it's not set out as kind of part of the learning process. It's just in there as what you do as a teacher. Education is a really diverse field, I suppose, that draws on lots of disciplines. So it draws on philosophy, it draws on history, it draws on psychology, it draws on sociology. And some of those perspectives mean that actually there's a different view of what knowledge is, and it's not about knowledge just as situated within the mind of a learner, but actually maybe it's something that we develop between people, between groups, between cultures. And so there are different perspectives actually on what knowledge is and what learning is that are still important in education that aren't quite represented. So I think I would also be doing my colleagues a disservice if I didn't sort of represent some of the wider concerns in the field of education about the core content framework. Questioning, is this really based on the best available educational research, as it claims. There's quite a lot of education research is not represented there. And this idea that by having these sort of statements, it seems to be presenting teaching as a kind of series of mini interventions without a kind of joined up sense of how they all work together and how they interact as a whole. There's a concern perhaps about some deprofessionalisation, that the permission to think is in the hands of the researchers. And I think perhaps for us as a community, it's worth thinking about these as some of the fears as well that need to be addressed in how we're talking about these ideas. So yeah, Jim Horden and Claire Brooks, really thoughtful work in this area. And also going back to Dan Willingham's work, he recognises that we've got these empirical generalisations, but they still only apply to one aspect of a really complex situation, and that educators are trying to consider all aspects of that situation. So we felt that we needed to go beyond the view of learning that was represented in the core content framework. We developed various materials, and these are sort of free to access online, different things that anyone can use if they would like to for any purpose whatsoever. We developed a document which sort of unpacked each statement of the core content framework, trying to help teacher educators relate it to their ideas, trying to find links to, for example, videos on your various websites, to help explain what the ideas in the core content framework were, particularly when they were new. Suddenly it arrived and everyone was expected to be good at this, so we needed some ways of helping teacher educators get familiar with this and understand it. And also thinking about how we could nudge it beyond, and that included making references to relevant bits of neuroscience. So this part was really about supporting teacher educators in their role. And the summary document was really a sense of, all right, what's our big overview? How are we going to go about this? Can we put this into words? And I think this can really be sort of summarised here as some of the contributions to a general approach that we're making. And the first point, which probably seems obvious to everyone in the room, but isn't always happening, is that we do need to be open to the insights from scientific research and from scientific perspectives. There's something that they have to offer alongside the existing education perspectives. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to take quite a broad view of the useful science, so gone beyond the cognitive psychology that's mentioned in the core content framework, which focuses on the working memory to long-term memory type models, the cognitive load models. And we want to include some neuroscience within this broader view. We think it's really important, though, to maintain that critical viewpoint and to recognise that what happens quite often is that neuroscience is, because it's sort of an authoritative science, it's given the final word on what is actually some quite complex, nuanced debates, and just to kind of be a bit aware of that and wary of it. And overall, we really want it to be used in a way that supports teacher judgment and supports teacher professionalism, enables them to make decisions with knowledge and understanding. So that's a little summary of what we've been doing at Bath-Spa. Things change, things move on, and that probably doesn't represent exactly what everyone's doing now. But as I say, I've got colleagues out there who will be able to tell you a bit more about the most up-to-date things. And it's quite a sensitive area because everyone's going through this reaccreditation process at the moment, and we have to do what we're told. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Kendra. Oh, yes, I won't. Almost trodden them. So what I'm going to do now is just tell you how we put educational neuroscience, or the science of learning, whatever you want to call it, into our teacher education programs. Some evidence of how that might impact on teachers' thinking. Some of the broader challenges that arise from those sorts of issues, and a potentially sort of radical approach to trying to understand and research those. So essentially 5 steps. We were supported, along with Kendra, we were supported by the Wellcome Trust in doing this. Assembled a team. We had about half a dozen scientists, educators, people, of course, who are on our PGCE. It was the PGC secondary that we've incorporated it into. one thing we had to do was to discuss how the different perspectives related to each other. So we weren't chucking out Vygotsky, we weren't chucking out Piaget. It was important for us to understand how the more recent scientific evidence actually relates to those. Developing the content, planning how we were going to deliver that, including, at what time during a teacher education course do people need this information? And actually, after the first year, I was able to argue quite successfully with the demand from the students that it would be quite early. So everybody is trying to teach everything early on a PGCE. There's a massive competition there. But the science of learning now comes very, very early on because students demand that they need to know something about learning before they even start thinking about everything else. And of course, monitoring and assuring, how do you do that? So the concepts that we deliver on the PGCE all derive from this categorization. I hesitate to call it a model. It's really just 3 categories of underlying learning processes that I think is important because I always feel challenged by this question that comes into my mind. A teacher comes up to me and says, okay, this educational neuroscience is all very well. What should I be thinking about when I go into a classroom then? And with this, I can say we should be thinking about engaging your students, building their knowledge, and consolidating that knowledge and understanding. And so by dividing our insights from science into those categories, and also having this sort of nifty 3 visuals as well, which tells us something about the brain processes involved. I always think it's one wonderful thing about the brain is that it gives you this possibility of having visual metaphors, which I think is helpful. It's a guide. It's a guide for student teachers and for teachers to think immediately about how this might apply to what they're doing in terms of their practice. This website will come up again in a minute, so don't worry if you wanted to pop it down and you haven't got it yet. Essentially, we summarize our science of learning into 10 scientific principles, if you like. They are not directives, they're not prescriptive about what teachers should be doing in the classroom. They don't tell you how to teach, but we do believe that they can give you insight into your teaching in terms of why it might work, but also sometimes why it might not work. And every trainee teacher has this in laminated form, I have to say. It's probably not very environmental, but never mind. In laminated form at the front of their teaching practice file. One check that we undertook was to make sure that these concepts that we were identifying were helpful in terms of understanding the most common, the most established, evidence-based teaching approaches that there are. Because it's no good if these concepts just explain rather obscure things in the classroom. They need to explain the mainstream methods that are used. So we did this sort of chart here just to check that out. How it fits with immense delight. I was immensely delighted when I saw that terms such as prior knowledge, working memory, long-term memory were in the core content framework and the early career framework. Slightly more dismayed that the way in which they're presented don't add up to this sort of a holistic understanding. I think it's less clear from this what a teacher should be thinking about when they enter the classroom. I suppose that's what I'm really saying. And as Kendra's already said, what's on the right-hand side of this document doesn't really clearly explain the relationship between these and teaching. So what happens is that a whole load of questions arise amongst teachers looking at these statements that really require a better understanding of the how and the why of learning. And that's what I feel our Engage, Build, Consolidate framework does. It gives you that underlying holistic understanding that allows you not just to be able to say, oh yes, I know about working memory, but to be able to say how it relates to your practice in the classroom, which is always going to be different. It's going to be different every day. So if you don't have that underlying understanding, you're not going to be able to really use these concepts effectively. So this is the website that we've built to tell you more about these concepts. There is a mapping on there to the early career framework and the core content framework. There are videos of mentors talking to student teachers about these ideas as well. So what happens when teachers encounter these concepts? Well, we hope that it improves the way they think about learning. How can we measure that? Well, one thing that we did was to arrange some performative concepts. Those are things which are not very insightful, but kind of teachers often carry around with them, rules of thumb, heuristics, things like a lesson must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A list of those together with our scientific concepts, and ask teachers to rate how valuable they thought they were for providing insight into the effectiveness of their lessons. And we did that rating before and after an hour and a half of professional development on our concepts. But actually one of the most interesting things was the initial data that we derived when we were asking about these ratings, because we were able to associate that, this is before they've had any professional development, with years of experience and age. So performative concepts, happily, you can see decrease. The more years of experience you have as a teacher, the less you believe in the usefulness of these pithy little heuristical ideas. And that's not so much true for years of experience in terms of science of learning concepts, but then that's understandable because actually your contact with the science of learning as a professional teacher is not going to be that great at the moment. Hopefully it will be improving, especially now we've got some of these concepts in the early career framework. But it is correlated positively with age. So the older that the teachers were, and presumably the more contact they'd had with these ideas in the outside universe, the more they began to believe in them. And our intervention accelerated that process, if you like. So 6 to 12 weeks later, we could see that their attribution of value to the scientific concepts was still greater than before the course, and also their reduction in the importance of performative concepts was still lower 6 to 12 weeks later. Now, this is all raising some interesting questions. Actually, what I found is, because I've been immensely involved in this educational neuroscience game for a long while, and I've been really enthusiastic about getting this to teachers. But of course, inevitably, and I'm sure Michael will agree with this, you come across some of the problems that a lot of researchers in education come across, whatever their ideas. And one of those is, how do you get them into the classroom? How do you get teachers to actually use this research? This has been a problem not just for the science of learning, but for all educational research. So when does professional development actually lead to improved learning? Unfortunately, the answer to that is small. And for early years and for primary schools, actually, you can't find the evidence that there is any impact of professional development on learning. Now, that's a huge problem for us if we are hoping that educational neuroscience is going to bring about change in terms of students' learning. So what is going on? Because, common sense sort of encourages you to think that if teachers have professional development, or they have, more initial teacher education or better teacher education, that's going to lead to improved learning. This relationship is just assumed by so many people, and yet we don't have the evidence to suggest that it's really there. And this is probably because actually there are many processes and things that have to happen between the teacher professional development arriving and a student learning something more effectively. And if you map these out, it might look something like this. And this is a large part of this along the top is actually from a review that I've been doing for the Centre for Early Mathematics Learning. And the way that you might break this down is that, first of all, you have to have the teachers engaged with the research. This is the part that most researchers think about, actually, when they think about impact. How can we get people to notice that we've got some research findings? But then they have to understand that research. We actually have got very little evidence of how that occurs and when it occurs. But even if they understand it, they've noticed it, they understand it, do they value it? Because they may have different priorities. For example, we know primary school teachers and early years teachers, the most important thing for them is actually the well-being of their child in a much broader sense. So they might not be so interested in the or they might not take it to a very high priority, the professional development that you're delivering. And also it may conflict with their values. Actually, they don't think learning is about the brain. They think it's about social relationships and things like that, and the brain doesn't involve social relationships, which of course it does, but the perceptions are really important. And then even if they value it, will they do it? Because actually they need to feel confident enough to do it. They need to have the support of their senior management quite often to be able to do it. They would like to see other teachers doing it, so they're not actually isolated. And even if they decide that they are going to do it, how are they going to do it? They're going to have to adapt it in some way. Do they feel equipped to do that? And if they do adapt it, is it an appropriate positive adaptation, or is it something that's going to undermine what occurs? And then even if they are doing it, do they carry on doing it? And then even if they do carry on doing it, is it actually affecting the learner's experience? And then even if it is affecting the learner's experience, is it actually going to improve the learning outcomes? So, it's not surprising when you start breaking it down that actually we have a very poor relationship between professional development and improved learning in classrooms. So what's the solution to this? How can we study this? This is where we need to do some research. During COVID, I started an experiment, chiefly because it was the only experiment I felt able to do during COVID, which is actually giving rise now to more work, and I'm carrying on with it, even though I can meet people face to face. We were asking people to teach each other online, one-to-one. We gave them 10 minutes to prepare, to teach a foreign language that they'd never seen before. The student had never seen it before. Some of these participants had a lot of teaching experience, some of them didn't. And what we found was that when we analysed the behaviours in terms of our understanding of engage, build, consolidate, then building and consolidate teaching behaviours did predict learning. So that's a really good thing. Interestingly, actually the engage teaching behaviours, which we measured as positive, as praise, were negatively correlated with learning outcomes. So this sort of experiment can really produce some unexpected results. And we've come to understand that by having a deeper understanding of the actual context in which these praise words were being offered. It may have more to do with the anxiety of the teacher, actually. So we had people going, good, 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 actually because they were incredibly nervous and insecure and they didn't feel their learner was learning. But also we can start answering some really fundamental questions with this sort of experiment. For example, experience as a language teacher, you would think, would offer something in this context. We had 15 of our participants who had years of experience as language teachers, not in the languages which we'd given them, but nevertheless, we do believe, don't we, in this concept of general pedagogical knowledge. However, it did not improve learning at all of their students. Now, one of the important things here, because I'm beginning to, for many years, I've said I don't believe in a science of teaching, and now I seem to be trying to establish one. So this is a difficult time for me. It's the first time I've ever presented this idea to anybody. I mean, I'm ready to get shot down, but I thought I'd produce this because it's quite controversial in a way, and it might get discussion going a bit on the tables. One criticism of this, and it's a criticism that is actually fired quite often at educational neuroscience generally, is that this is scientism, and that education is being scientized, and you can't study teaching in using these sorts of experiments, because like RCTs, for example, they don't capture the detail. They don't. They're not giving permission to think, if you like, as Kendra put it. There was another phrase which is really brilliant that you put on there, which is something like a series of decontextualized, narrow, something or others interventions. But actually, this sort of study can really offer some fantastic qualitative analysis as well, and really show you the depth and detail. Now, this is under review at the moment, this paper, though I think it's just about to get published. The reviewers keep asking me, why are you doing this diagram? This diagram is really important to me. So I'm going to have another shot at trying to explain it. Essentially, it's a Venn diagram. What we did was we put these sets in this Venn diagram are all made up of teachers who exhibited one or more instance of a subcategory of teaching behaviour that we were qualitatively analysing. This is just for consolidation behaviours, I should say, as well. The unions of these sets then basically tell you the teachers that combined these different behaviours. And the important thing is that actually in most of these intersections, you can see there's just one or two teachers. The conclusion is, and you might need some more time to think about this, certainly our reviewers do at the moment, but the basic conclusion is that most teachers display a combination of behaviours shared by no more than one other teacher. In other words, this is only a 15-minute teaching burst period, okay? But even in that 15 minutes, because we are giving the teacher permission to think, because they are going off and doing all their own things, we're not telling them how to teach, actually we do see this incredible heterogeneity, this incredible complexity in terms of what teachers are doing, and this actually can capture some of that, even though it's not like teaching a class, it's not like teaching face-to-face, and you are teaching adults, I still am beginning to believe that actually this type of experiment could answer some fundamental questions, such as what happens when you tell a teacher about working memory. This is an experiment we're running at the moment. Does it improve the learning of their student? But also, how do they receive that concept? How do they turn it into a practice? How does that practice express itself? So this experimental pilot, I think, discourages notions that science always offers a simple prescriptive list of effective teaching behaviours. Not at all. And rather than produce these decontextualised interventions with narrow objectives, this sort of experimental study might actually be able to reveal the complexity of teaching and help us understand some very fundamental, but so far chiefly hypothetical relationships for which we have no evidence, but are absolutely crucial for pushing forward this educational neuroscience mission, and in fact many other educational missions as well.
So, Paul Howard-Jones, thank you so much for contributing to today's workshop. What were the highlights for you?
Well, of course, I really enjoyed your talk, Michael.
Thank you.
Say that. No, but it was important to me because I think we have to bring in policymakers into the conversation, and that's what I was hearing you talking about. And really nothing's going to move forward unless we have that communication and we get them convinced that this is something that needs to take a priority. There's so many pressures on education and on educational thinking, but really a scientific understanding of learning has to be a primary concern, I think.
Fantastic. So, do you think as we come to the end of today's workshop that we've moved educational neuroscience along, for example, on how it might contribute to teacher training?
I think that there is some progress being made on that front, yes. I mean, there's there's 2 or 3 universities, I think, that are already putting science of learning in a meaningful way into their teacher education. But I'm also aware that there are many teacher educators who lack confidence in this area, and there are many teachers being trained who will not come in contact with those with expertise in the mind and the brain required to really sort of shed light on how that relates to teaching and classroom practice. So we are making steps, but I think I would probably call them baby steps. I think there's an awful lot of work left to be done.
So lots of potential, lots of work to be done.
Lots of exciting potential, and we are making progress, so let's be positive, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, yeah.
Fantastic. So could you tell me a little bit about what you covered in your talk today?
Well, I was talking about teacher education, and I think, I was talking about the processes by which we put science of learning into teacher education, but I was also pointing out that there are a lot of assumptions made about how, when you provide professional development on a particular area, science of learning or anything else, it doesn't necessarily have any great impact. It doesn't necessarily change a teacher's practice. It doesn't necessarily improve students' learning. There's a whole series of interim processes that need to happen before you can actually see that benefit in a school. And that's very under-researched, and it needs greater attention. And I just think, perhaps inevitably, with our enthusiasm for science of learning, we haven't always anticipated coming across these problems that all researchers in education have, which is about making impact, being heard by policymakers, yes, but also finding ways of communicating to teachers and finding ways of supporting them and actually introducing change into the classroom in a way that benefits learners.
You showed us some fascinating data when you studied actual teachers in the activity of teaching and showing how different they could be teaching the same kind of content. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose in a way this sort of relates to this idea that we don't know what happens when we start talking to teachers about educational neuroscience. And how can you find out that? And that's when, during COVID I started experimenting, because there wasn't many other things that you could do during COVID, but I started experimenting online, finding out what happened when pairs were teaching each other something that they'd never seen before. And this seems to me a possible basis, it's a possible paradigm, it's a possible type of task that you could use to experimentally study the relationship between teaching and learning, because there's an awful lot that we don't know about. And our science of learning, our educational neuroscience, is mostly stemmed from laboratory studies of how learning occurs. And then with those basic principles, we are hoping to be able to transform education. But actually, we also need to know about teaching. And I don't see any reason why a science of teaching is not possible. Using these types of tasks, because obviously there's an awful lot of limitations, a lot of things you've got to remember. This is not a classroom, this is not a class of children or whatever. You can't focus in that way on teaching and learning in a laboratory experiment, but we certainly can use those sort of experiments to tackle some fundamental questions, such as, does teaching actually impact on learning?
And why do you think the teachers who you studied were so different in the methods they used?
I think teachers, so there's a difference. When you're studying learning, I think it's sort of acceptable in a way to constrain the learner, because teachers often do constrain learners. They say, do this, do that, try to think about this and that, these are the steps that I'd like you to go through. When you're studying teaching, teachers have much more freedom, they're much more autonomous. They should be allowed, and to be effective they must be able to pursue freely willed trajectories and go off in all sorts of different directions, responding to the learner. And that makes it much more difficult to study those things. But I think in the sort of experiments that we're doing now, where you're not telling the teacher what to do, you're finding out what they do, then I think you're going to naturally see that diversity, that heterogeneity in different approaches.
Terrific. So, tell me a little bit, what's next for you in your research?
Well, I want to carry on pursuing this science of teaching idea, but I think it's something that actually needs to be. I want to get more discussion around this and debate, and also understanding about it, because I'm keen that it doesn't feed into some of the arguments that are resisting a sort of scientisation of education, because I'm quite empathetic to some of those ideas, really. I don't think it needs to. I think it could be more enlightening than that, this sort of lab-based work. But also, I'm very interested in climate change education now, so I'm going to be pursuing that road as well.
Fantastic, that's really interesting. So Paul Howard-Jones, many thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
So welcome to the afternoon session. Seriously, we hope you enjoyed the lunch. This next session, presented by Duncan Astle, Department of Psychiatry in MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge. And he's going to be talking to us about the barriers to learning. The science of learning is incomplete without understanding variability.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Duncan. I'm a neuroscientist, and we study brain development in childhood. Mostly our work covers kind of 5 through 12 years of age, but we do extend kind of beyond those boundaries. And in the talk, I've got quite a lot of science in the talk, which hopefully will be reasonably well explained and understandable, but also some translation at the end. So, what are the key messages for the talk that you're about to experience? That is not one of my key messages, but First key message is that we should, I don't know why we're always surprised when there's lots of variability in kids' cognitive abilities in the classroom, right? We should expect variability in children's cognitive skills, and plenty of it. And in the first part of the talk, I'll explain more about exactly how much variability and in what ways might we expect to encounter it. Secondly, this variability is an inevitable and very natural consequence of the way and the mechanics of brain development. So in the second part of the talk, it's going to get a bit kind of sciencey, and I'll talk you through a little bit of our work on trying to model and map how brains change as they develop, how they organize themselves, and what might drive the variability that you see. Thirdly, maybe controversially, I think the evidence suggests so far that this variability in cognitive skills cannot be fixed, even if that was something that we wanted to do. And so ultimately, what we need are good supports and modifications that make education accessible. So that gives you a quick rundown of what we're going to cover. So, as I'm sure lots of people here know already, cognitive development varies widely across children, worldwide. I can't see my own slides, which is why I keep turning to remind myself what's on them. Worldwide, about 15% of children would meet criteria for a recognized neurodevelopmental condition. Who knows what that percentage should be, but I think 15% is a reasonable estimate. Depends where you live, depends how you define it. But really, those children are at the intersection of multiple different continuous distributions. Right? The point is that there's lots of variability. But these differences can act as lifelong barriers to education, well-being, healthcare, and employment. And in my research, we explore the role that the brain might play in driving those differences in cognitive ability. And we used multiple different kind of techniques, sometimes called informatics. But basically, it gives us a kind of empirical framework that allows us to work across the multiple levels of analysis, all of which might be relevant for understanding where that variability comes from and why some people encounter barriers to learning, like cognitive barriers. And in the talk today, I'm hopefully going to cover three things. Firstly, how much variability should I expect to encounter in class? Where does this variability likely come from? And what does it mean for education? Okay, so part one. How much variability should I expect? And to introduce that, I'm going to tell you briefly about a study called the Center for Attention, Learning and Memory, or CALM. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about it before. Essentially, it's a cohort of children, about 1,000 children, and this cohort's enriched for children at neurodevelopmental risk. And what we mean by that is that 800 of the kids have been referred by a professional working in a school or working in healthcare who has identified that children is experiencing cognitive barriers to learning. And so most of the children come from routes like child and adolescent mental health services, pediatrics, ed psychs, clin psychs, specialist teachers, SENCOs, occupational therapists. Basically, if that person in their professional work comes into contact with kids, some of whom might be encountering cognitive difficulties, they can refer the kid to the study. The children can come with single, multiple, or no formal diagnostic labels. That's really important because the majority of kids out there in classrooms who are struggling don't have any kind of formal label. They're all in mainstream education. They actually age from 5 through to 18. There's a big clump of them aged 7 to 11. We can discuss later on why that might be. I think it's probably because that's when people start to recognize that differences are emerging. And 2/3 of them are boys. Again, we can discuss why that might be later on. Okay, so the kids come to see us. They're only too... Does the laser work? Kinda. They're only too happy to spit in a pot to provide a DNA sample. They're invited to go through the MRI scanner, 4 or 5 hours worth of cognitive assessments. Whilst the caregivers are captive, we get them to complete multiple questionnaires about behavior, measures of learning like literacy, numeracy, spelling, and measures of mental health. And you can see that creates a really, really rich resource that you can use to answer all sorts of questions about variability in kids in mainstream education. Loads of projects already using this data set, about 75 already. We just finished the follow-up 5 years later. And the data are now available to anyone who would like to use them. I'll show this QR code again towards the end. So if you would like to access the data to make use of it, then you can do that now as well. Okay, and there are lots of different ways that we can use a data set like this to explore the idea of variability. And the way that I'm going to introduce that we did it is using something called machine learning, which you'll have heard of, and sounds super fancy, but it's really very, very simple at its heart. And whilst you might not think that you've ever used machine learning, actually you're using it all the time. Every time you Google something and you type something into that search window, what you don't realize is behind the scenes there's a little algorithm, and it is learning about the information you feed it. And it's building a little model of you and the things that you're interested in. And what you might notice is that next time you log on, down the sides, you've got all sorts of adverts for things that you happen to be interested in, right? And that's because it's made a model of you, and it's found out that your model is like somebody else's, and they also were interested in these things, and that's how they're targeting you with the adverts. Okay, so that's the basic idea. It's a type of machine learning called, it's unsupervised, so it's learning the inherent structure of the data. And I'm going to introduce to you how it works with these fruit. So lemons, melons, oranges. You're probably all very familiar with fruit already. So let's imagine for a minute that we could parameterize each fruit. We could give it 3 values, maybe size, acidity, seeds, whatever. And we start off with a network of nodes. So we've got 3 nodes in our network, and each one of these nodes has 3 values associated with it. And we call them weights for argument's sake, but they're exactly the same thing as these values that describe the items. And the way that the training works is we initialize the weights, we give them some initial plausible values, and then we start the training process. And the way that works is we take the first item and we find the node in the network that has the weights that best match the values for that item. So maybe the lemon goes here somewhere, we allocate the lemon to its best matching node or unit, and then we update the weights for that node or unit so they become a little bit more like the lemon that just went in, the values for the lemon. We take the next piece of fruit, this melon here, we find where it fits, we allocate it, we update the weights of that node so they become a bit more like the values for the melon. Orange goes in, update the weights, raspberry goes in, update the weights, and so on. So gradually over time, what we're doing is we're trying to learn about the variability that exists in this mixed fruit data set, right? And so you might imagine after some initial learning, it's learned, for instance, there's a kind of group of these sorts of large watery fruits with lots of seeds, these little sweet things, these sort of citrusy things. And so that the weights of the nodes are being adjusted to try and optimally represent the data set. Okay. What you can also see is that it's struggling to resolve some differences. And a neat feature of the little algorithm we used is that it can adjust its own structure as it learns. So as it's learning, adjusting its weights, it might learn that it needs to add in additional nodes so that next time around, it can learn the distinction between the citrus fruits and the apples, pears, and guavas. So that's the basic idea. We've got this kind of mixed data set, and we're going to try and use this algorithm to learn something about the inherent variability that exists within it. Another nice little feature is that it can spawn its own subnetworks, right? So it might learn there's a noisy category here, berries, and to optimally represent it, we need a little subnetwork to capture the loganberries, raspberries, blueberries, and so on. I've learned a lot about fruit making these slides. So you might think, well, that's really interesting, but why bother? Why bother using this machine learning? Well, the first thing is you might learn something, right? So the whole idea of this cohort is a kind of all-comers. These kids are all in mainstream education. You could encounter all of them in a classroom. And if professionals were to say, send the kids that they are worried about in terms of experiencing cognitive barriers to learning, who are those kids? What are their profiles? And the whole point of an approach like this is to take a data-driven, bottom-up approach of learning something fundamental about the structure of that data set. So the second thing, as you'll see later, it makes a model of the data, and you can use that to make predictions, which, as we'll see later on, could be a really, really useful tool. For instance, what predicts whether you encounter different cognitive difficulties? Okay, so we've got our network, and of course, we're not actually learning about fruit, we're learning about children. So we've got this really interesting cohort of kids, enriched for kids who are experiencing, most of the kids are identified as experiencing some kind of difficulty. And we don't know about their size, acidity, seeds, and so on, but we do know a ton about their cognitive abilities. So we've got multiple measures of memory, vocabulary, listening skills like phonological awareness, different types of attention, multiple measures of working memory. And the idea is that if we put these in, we train up the network, what will it learn? Will it learn a kind of structure that we're familiar with, or will it learn something less expected? Okay. So there are multiple ways of me showing you what the network has learned, and this is just the way that I find intuitive, and hopefully you will once I've explained it. So what I'm showing you is the network from above, so you're looking down on it, and each one of these nodes is one of the nodes in the network that we trained up, and what I've plotted is those nodes in what we call Euclidean distance space. That simply means that if two nodes are close together, that means they have really similar weights. They're representing really similar children. If they're a long way away from each other, they have really different weights. They're representing really different children, okay? And so we can now explore the network, these nodes, to find out what kids went into the training process. And so first you can see that it learned this top layer in blue, layer 1, kind of mapped out the course space, and then the layer beneath in yellow, which is irritatingly hard to see from the back, and then in some cases a layer beneath. But we can explore this overall kind of wonky pear shape to tell us something about the kind of multi-dimensional space that describes kids in this interesting cohort. Right? So over here on the left, you find that there are actually a pocket of kids with really good cognitive performance, way above what you'd expect for their age. And if you move from left to right, you find pockets of kids with entirely age-appropriate cognitive skills on all the measures, slightly better at spatial things or verbal things, but basically where you'd expect them to be. And in fact, a quarter of all the children who are referred for experiencing difficulties related to learning, when you get them one-to-one and do the assessment, their cognitive skills are entirely where you'd expect them to be for their age. Right? So again, another discussion to have at the end is, so why is it that those kids are struggling? But as we move from left to right, you see that things really, really fan out. Things get much more variable. And you find a pocket of kids up here who really struggle with things like spatial short-term memory, matrix reasoning. They struggle with measures of attention. I've said spatial cognition difficulties here, but executive function difficulties would be another perfectly reasonable label, I think. Down here, you find a pocket of kids who really struggle with things like phonological awareness, forwards digit span, backwards digit span. Any tasks that involve a kind of verbal code, they find really difficult. And their parents also report that those kids struggle with things like syntax and grammar. Right? So it's a kind of noisy language difficulties group. And then round at the bottom, you find a pretty sizable cluster of kids, about a quarter of the sample, who struggle with every task that we've given them. And just to give you context, like this kind of wonky pear shape, kids up here are around 2 or 3 years ahead of what you'd expect for their age. So their scores, roughly speaking, are equivalent to a child who's 2 or 3 years older than they are. Kids down here, their cognitive profiles are roughly equivalent to a child who's 2 or 3 years younger than they are. And of course, all these kids could be in the same class. So in the same class, you could find kids whose cognitive profiles are typical of a range of around 5 or 6 years, which I can imagine if you're a teacher is a challenge. Okay, so the obvious thing then is, if we've got all this variability in cognitive profiles, what predicts it, right? So what predicts what your cognitive profile is? So an obvious thing you might think is, well, a lot of these kids have got diagnoses, right? They've been given a formal label of something. Surely that would predict their cognitive profile. So for argument's sake, there are plenty of kids in there that have an ADHD diagnosis. If all kids with ADHD have executive function difficulties, which is a very common account of or theory of ADHD, then those kids should sit kind of predominantly up there in the network, because that's where the networks are representing those profiles, right? Alternatively, if having a diagnosis of ADHD doesn't tell you anything particular about your cognitive profile, then you'd expect those kids to be randomly scattered throughout the network. And that's exactly what you find. In fact, that's what you find for the main labels that exist in the CALM cohort, which leads you to a kind of really simple conclusion, which is simply that diagnosis is not a good predictor of a child's cognitive profile. Right? And I'm not suggesting for a second that that means that the process of diagnosis is not important, or that having a diagnosis is not important. There are lots of reasons why it is. My point is simply that it is not a good indicator of children's cognitive profiles. And if we're therefore using it as a way of determining what kind of supports they get, you can see that that could be problematic. This is something that we've written about a lot for education audiences and for academic audiences. Okay, right. So one thing we know a lot about these kids is their actual educational attainment, because we've got all these other assessments that we did on the kids. And so one thing we could now do is explore where kids sit in this cognitive space, the wonky pair space, does it predict their learning? And the way that you do that is with something called cross-validation, where you train it up on a portion of the sample and then see if it's predictive in the held-out bit. I won't bore you with the details, but what you basically find is that you can make a pretty good prediction of a child's educational profile, so their literacy, numeracy, spelling, and so on, from where they sit in this cognitive space. Substantially better than chance. So Cohen's d of about 0.5. Any statisticians in the audience will know that's a kind of like a medium effect size. You'd be pleased to find that. If that hadn't worked, then I think we'd worry that the whole thing has gone wrong somewhere. But what it basically tells you is that if we know where the kid sits in this multidimensional cognitive space, it makes a pretty good prediction of their educational profile, right? What about their brains, right? We've got all this brain imaging data, and one type of brain scan we've got is called a T1 weighted image. A T1 weighted image is really looking at the outer 6 millimeters of your brain, otherwise known as cortex, otherwise known as gray matter. And so across multiple regions, you can see them colored in. If you want to know why we chose those regions, then ask me at the end. It's not exciting, but across these regions, we could estimate for each child different qualities of the gray matter in their brain. And then we can see, right, can we predict from this where they sit in the cognitive space? And the answer is that we can, but not very well. Right? So you can see that the prediction drops to a Cohen's d of 0.15, just above what you'd expect by chance. Right? It's still significant, so we've got hundreds and hundreds of children, but it's a really small prediction. And what that tells you is that whether or not kids have a bit more or less gray matter here or there doesn't really tell you very much about their cognitive profile. Okay, right, another type of brain scan we've got, this is quite sciencey, I now realize, giving the talk, is what's called a diffusion scan, right? So the way a diffusion scan works, we already saw some images from the Human Connectome project of a diffusion scan. The way that it works, if you imagine I had an invisible pipe, and we can't see the pipe, but I can track the diffusion of water molecules. And what you'd expect is that they should go along the pipe much more easily than they would go through the wall of the pipe. And if I could track the water molecules and their movements, I could probably infer the presence of the pipe even though it's invisible. And that's basically how diffusion imaging works. And so we're using that diffusion to map the kind of main highways of communication in the brain, these kind of insulated fibers that connect different regions. And so on the far left, you can see, quite small for you guys, is a diffusion scan from a 9-year-old boy. And on the right is what we call a connectome. It's a model that we've built using the data from that child, right? So it's a kind of wiring diagram, a kind of really simplified wiring diagram of that kid's brain. And when you look at a connectome like that, what you find is that it's not randomly organized, right? It has a really characteristic organization to it. And you can quantify it mathematically, and it's called being small world. And what small world means is you have hubs. Get this to work. You have hubs, which mean that you can get from A to B in the network with relatively few jumps. And it has clusters, groups of nodes that are really densely interconnected. Right? It's a bit like transport networks. It turns out lots of networks that are efficient have small worlds. Even social networks, you'll find that someone's the social hub, and they have a little cluster around them. Same is true of people's brains. And you can quantify that in different ways. You can measure the integration of different networks, how modular they are, the role of particular brain regions. And so you can take this approach and do exactly the same thing, right? Can we predict where a kid sits based on these properties of how their brains are wired up? And to cut the story short, you can, and it's based upon the connectivity of certain key regions that we sometimes call hubs, sometimes called the rich club. These are parts of the brain that are very densely connected. And they make a really pretty good prediction of where kids sit in that cognitive space, so a Cohen's d of about 0.9. And the reason that they're really good is because they're doing something quite simple, which is basically the kids whose brains are more small world, they've got these really densely connected hubs, those kids are more likely to be up at this end and have really good cognitive performance. Kids where their brains are a bit more randomly organized, they tend to find themselves a little bit more down here. Okay, so part one, you'll be relieved to know, is done. So cognitive profiles of children in mainstream school can differ really widely in overall profile, but also in overall scope. These differences do not align well with the formal diagnostic labels that the kids have, but they are related to individual differences in attainment, so they are relevant. And how children's brains are organized is predictive of these differences in cognition. Okay, so that is part one. So that was not the sciencey bit. The sciencey bit is coming next. Okay, so I thought that as someone who's a neuroscientist, that you might be interested to know, like, so where does this variability come from? Like, so why is it that our brains are all so different from each other's? And the take-home message, if you're about to kind of doze off for the next 6 minutes, is that it's not a bug of human brain development, it is a feature. And many people have argued that one of the reasons as a species that we are so successful is the diversity of brain organization that you see across the species. Okay. So there's a guy called Richard Feynman who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist whom I know like next to nothing about, other than he gave this really great quote, which is, "What I cannot build, I do not understand." Right? And so, of course, studying the human brain is really, really tricky because you're trying to understand the thing with the very thing itself. And the basic idea that Richard Feynman was articulating here is that in order to build something, you have to really fundamentally understand how it works, like the principles of it, right? And so let's imagine for a minute that I scanned everybody's brain in the room. Could I build a really simple model that would simulate how your connectome formed over time? And if I varied that simulation systematically, kind of bringing in different constraints, could I get it just right? As in, could I recreate the kind of constraints that probably were driving the development of the brain you've got, such that it's organized the way it is? And for each person, could I tweak that simulation ever so slightly to capture the differences between people's brains? And might that tell me something really fundamental about why differences in brain organization emerge, right? And so that's the basic idea of what Richard Feynman was articulating, and it's an approach that we've used which is called generative network modeling. All right, so the basic idea is we're going to try and simulate how connectomes form over time. We're going to do that for our kids, and then we're going to use it as a way of exploring where the variability comes from. So tiny bit of maths. At the heart of it is a really simple equation. So let's imagine you've got two brain areas, brain area I and J, and we could calculate the probability of them wiring together as a trade-off between two things. So the probability of them wiring together is a trade-off between this thing and this thing. Right? The first thing is cost. So if I and J are really, really close to each other, that's going to be a really cheap connection to form. If I and J are a long way away from each other in the brain, that's going to be a really expensive connection to form and maintain over time. Right? So the first part of the equation is about cost. How expensive is it in biological terms for you to connect those bits of brain? And the second part of the equation is what we call value. So value is any non-geometric, non-spatial property of I and J. For example, let's imagine I and J are a long way away, but they already have lots of neighbors in common. Right? If that's how I've defined this second part, then despite the distance, they might wire together. It's a bit like if someone in Australia who's a long way away, but if you and them had lots of friends in common, the chances of you forming a social connection with them massively increase. Right? So that's one example of the trade-off, right? There's the cost part, the distance, and the value part, which in this case is defined by number of friends in common. And that's basically how this equation works. It's like an economic trade-off. The cost of the connection, the value that it brings. And then every time you run a simulation, you can tweak it. The etas and the gammas allow you to adjust the contribution of the cost part and the values part. Okay, it's a bit esoteric, so here's a worked example. So let's imagine that node 2 is about to form a connection. There's no other connections in this little network. So for argument's sake, it just forms a connection with something nearby, this one here, node 36. And you can see that the distances that plotted here just perfectly mirror the probabilities. The thing that's closest is the thing that wires, right? Later on in time, there's quite a few connections in the network. Node 2 is about to form another connection. So this time, there's one option is to form this cheap, short-range connection with node 27. Alternatively, it could lay down this long-range connection all the way over with node 59. Right? Node 59, long way away, really expensive, but it already shares 1, 2 nodes in common. It's already got some friends. And so because this is the way that we've calibrated the equation in this simulation, it forgoes the cheap short-range connection and lays down the expensive long-range connection. And you can see now that the distances no longer mirror the probabilities. And that's because there's this other part of the equation, the kind of neighborhood matching. So you get this kind of interesting phenomena whereby early on it's all driven by cost, but then over time the simulation starts to drive itself. So the neighborhood structure starts to predict what connects later on. And you can see that it creates a kind of stochastic process. So early on in development, you can see where the connection's about to form. Here, this orangey bit, connection goes in, and what you can hopefully see is that these colors change a lot, and that's because as soon as that connection goes in, the neighborhood structure changes, new connections become possible. So the whole network can suddenly get steered down a different trajectory. So that basically is like generative modeling 101. That's basically how the simulation works. And so this is work done by Dan, and so what he did is he used it to simulate the brains of the children in the CALM cohort that I told you about. So we're simulating the brains, and each time we run a simulation, we get the same number of connections, and then we compare it to the child's actual brain network. And we want to say, how good is the simulation? And we compare them using an energy equation. It's so boring, I'm not going to introduce that. But the basic idea is that if it's a high-energy simulation, that means it's rubbish. It means your simulation's really different to the real thing. If it's a low-energy simulation, that means it's really good. That means that you've done a really good job of simulating the characteristics of that kid's brain network. So that's what Dan's doing. He's simulating the networks, and each time he runs a simulation, he tests to see how good it is. Right? Remember, we've got these two parameters, the eta and the gamma. They're ways of tuning it. So every time he runs a simulation, he's changing the contribution of these two parts of the equation, the trade-off. Again, each time he evaluates the energy equation to see whether he's got any better. I've given you one example of what K is, this values term, this neighborhood matching. There's loads of things you could put in there. Again, he repeats it, and he evaluates the energy for the different terms. And when you do that, what you basically find is that some models do better than others. And the very, very best model of all is this one here. And it's this one down here, this little red one. It's part of a class of model called homophily, which simply means that things will wire to things that are similar to themselves. And the very best model of all is the neighborhood matching rule that I cannily gave you as the example. So when you trade this principle off the kind of distance penalty, it produces really realistic brains, right? So realistic that if I had a stack of the real things, I had a stack of the simulations, you would not be able to tell the difference between them, and an algorithm wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them, right? So it tells you something really fundamental about how everybody's brain is organized, right? It's a kind of economic trade-off between maximizing something whilst minimizing the cost of producing that thing. Okay, but there's a bit of nuance, which is that for all the low-energy simulations come from this tiny portion of the space, right? So these are all the gammas that we tried, these are all the etas that we tried, and the low-energy simulations all come from that tiny blue slither. And if I zoom in, then each one of these x's is one of the children from the CALM cohort. So for each child, there is a subtly different trade-off going on over the course of their development, right? This economic trade-off between minimizing cost and maximizing this kind of shared connection. And these differences might look really, really tiny, but as I showed you, these slight changes, because it kind of feeds forward in time, you get this kind of updating process, it can gradually steer the network down a different path. And so basically, tiny amounts of variability can generate really diverse trajectories. I'm going to skip this because it's tedious. But basically what it shows is that The cost part of the equation is more similar across kids. This updating of neighborhoods is massively variable, 15 times more variable than the cost part of the equation. And when you multiply those two things together, that's what creates these really, really variable wiring patterns that you see in kids' brains. Okay. It's driven by the environment. I'm not going to tell you how we know that. It's also driven by genes, right? So children's early experiences, we know from human work and animal work, changes this trade-off, and that shapes how the network develops. Individual differences in genetics, not one or two genes, but thousands of genes, adjusts that trade-off and shapes the way that the networks form. Okay, so we can simulate the formation of kids' brains by trading these two things off. They produce really realistic simulations, but this trade-off is slightly different for every person in this room, every child in your class. These small differences can generate really diverse trajectories of brain development, and in turn, these differences are likely shaped by both environmental experiences, especially early in life, and genetics. Okay, so that's a very whistle-stop tour that we should expect a lot of variability, and that this is a natural consequence of the way that brains develop and organize over time. So what does it mean for education? I've got no idea how long I've got, but I'm sure I'll get it in on time. 10 minutes, perfect. That's exactly what I need. Okay. So the obvious thing you might think is, well, look, if you've got these differences in cognition, fix them, right? If we fix those differences, then we sort of remove the barriers, jobs are good. And the idea that boosting cognition actually is a really popular one, and we ourselves have indulged in it. So we did a lot of work on working memory training, but there's lots of other training literatures going on. This is an image from one of our early studies, basically looking at kids who've had like an adaptive working memory training versus a non-adaptive. And what you can see, without knowing anything about the study, is that before the training happened, the kids were performing similarly. After the training happened, the kids with the adaptive training show these boosts. So we have boosted their working memory performance. We spent a lot of time scanning kids' brains with different types of technology and showing all these interesting differences after the training, which from a neuroscientist was a really exciting thing, but practically speaking wasn't usually very helpful, right? So most of the studies, in fact, well, arguably all, but you can train kids on all sorts of things and they will get better at those things, but though the training doesn't tend to generalize much beyond the limits of what you trained. Which means from a kind of experimental perspective, it's interesting, but from a practical perspective, it's not all that useful. I'm not saying that we will never hit upon some kind of training regime that suddenly really does unlock things, but I think that the evidence that it exists so far is very sketchy. Okay, so an alternative is that if we cannot change cognition, then how do we make education inclusive, right? So if this variability is a fact of life, and it's something that we will encounter in every classroom, then what do we do about it? And that was indeed the topic of a workshop that we ran towards the end of last year, funded by Templeton World Charity Foundation, which was called Diverse Trajectories to Good Developmental Outcomes. And essentially we gathered around 100 experts, and when we say experts, we mean not just academics, definitely not academics, but lots of practitioners working in different fields and lots of people with lived experience, including young people who had recently finished their education and their parents. We had focus groups, we had talks from the front and these kind of long discussion periods, and we are working to co-create a series of resources to try and guide schools about inclusive practices. I'll show you in a second where you can get your hands on this information. But I thought what would be helpful would be for me to tell you what the main take-home messages were from the workshop. What did we learn? Okay, well, a little bit of background that you guys know already. So inclusion for children is mandated practice in the UK. In England, it's framed around SEND, but differently in different countries. So in Scotland, for instance, it's not quite the same. In 2022, there are about 1.4 million state students with SEND in England, and that's steadily rising. And in about 2 or 3 years, it potentially will get to about 20% of kids in schools. A couple of quotes I found. One from the National Audit Office said, "The system of supporting pupils with SEND is not on current trends financially sustainable." Another cheery quote, Even significant funding increases might make little difference to children and young people with SEND. Right? Such is the scale of the challenge, that the amount of resources there to meet it is insufficient, in essence. So in England, the diagnostic labels often gate access to support, but as we've shown just a few slides ago, they give only a limited snapshot and a static snapshot of the kids' needs. And other problem with this is that social inequalities in access to support interact with these learning barriers, compounding the exclusion problem. When I say exclusion, I mean in both senses, both excluded literally from school, but also practically excluded as they're not able to access it. So, for example, one of the key messages from the workshop was looking at data. Say, for instance, if you're a black boy in primary school with ADHD, your chances of getting all the way through your education system unscathed are actually quite slim. Okay, so what were the messages from the workshop? So the first one is that children with SEND, the children who are experiencing cognitive difficulties in the classroom, are much more likely to face bullying and exclusion in both senses. And so we talked about ways that we can tackle this. So one of them is to normalize differences in the classroom and celebrate diversity. When I say normalize differences, I don't mean correct differences, but I mean make commonplace differences that exist. And in a minute, I'll talk you through some ideas of how you might do that. But essentially, for instance, if Simon needs to take more breaks and go and run around the classroom, then if his classmates understand that that helps Simon concentrate when he's in class, then that might have an awful lot of bearing on how included he feels in the education process. Equip the workforce for inclusive practices, eliminate unfair school incentives such as attendance prizes. So we had a lot of experiences from young people in the workshop who found that a lot of the incentives, for instance, getting prizes and having ranking boards for who's attended the most. When you are experiencing barriers to education, that kind of stuff is cruel, and it draws attention to the fact that whatever the barriers you're experiencing are, they become very public. And offer solutions and accommodations rather than punishing students for having support needs, which I guess is a fairly self-explanatory thing. But our first key message was really about how and why kids who have these cognitive difficulties experience exclusion in schools, whether they have a formal label or not. And that leads me on to tell you about LEANS, which some of you may have heard of already, which stands for Learning About Neurodiversity in School. It is a free resource pack to introduce these kinds of concepts to mainstream primary school classes. It's complete with stories and workbooks. If you go to the QR code, it'll take you to their website and you can access all their materials. Coincidentally, tomorrow at 5 o'clock, there is a free webinar that people can attend with the fabulous Alyssa Alcorn, who will be taking people through it. But it's a really nice pack of resources for essentially that schools, that classrooms can follow to try and educate and make mainstream the idea that there are differences between kids in the classroom that is entirely expected and entirely normal and should be celebrated, to try and minimize exclusion in both senses. Okay, second key message was about universal design approaches. So to try and enable all learners to flourish, the UK system, this is what came out of the workshop, not my words, needs to move from inclusion on demand to inclusion by design. What do we mean by inclusion by design? So if you're a wheelchair user, for example, you might arrive at school and discover something like this, and you might think, it's great, inclusion, right? They've got the ramp there. But the problem is that what the ramp kind of shows or says is that when this school was designed, it wasn't designed with you in mind. We didn't imagine someone like you would need to be using it. And so alternatives are things like this, because this is just an analogy. And actually, as it turns out, friends who use wheelchairs tell me they absolutely hate these staircases. So let's not take the analogy too far. But the basic point is about thinking in advance about what differences we might encounter and who needs to access this system, and thus what supports need to be in place for everyone. You guys will have heard of it already. It's Universal Design for Learning, UDL systems. And the idea is to try and, rather than kind of catering for a minority of students, trying to consider all students' needs and make the system accessible. And so luckily for us, New Zealand has recently launched a Universal Design for Learning system. And their website, the government website's got lots of really good resources that we have rated. This nice image, for instance, that's where I stole that. So basically, learn about the people in context, understand what the goal and purpose is, identify what the barriers might be, identify universal supports, make a plan using the kind of UDL principles, teach, evaluate, revise, come back to the start. The key principles are to try and provide multiple ways of engaging with learning, provide information in multiple formats, provide multiple means of demonstrating knowledge. This stuck with me from the workshop, which was the example that someone gave. Rubik's Cube, we're already familiar with it. This is another analogy. I'm not saying that teaching is like a Rubik's Cube. But imagine that if you're blind, suddenly doing the Rubik's Cube is really, really challenging. And so what someone very helpfully produced is, you might be able to see it from the back, this is a Braille Rubik's Cube, right? So you think, great, we've got inclusion, right? We've got a Rubik's Cube for the sighted people, we've got a Rubik's Cube for the blind people, everyone can have a go with the Rubik's Cube. But of course, this is one way of thinking about inclusion. A really inclusive solution would be this, which is just a Rubik's Cube that everyone can use, right? So it's got the colors, but it's also, they've textured the squares such that everyone can use it. And that's I think quite a nice example of a way of thinking about what we mean by inclusion, right? It's not always just thinking about what's the thing that this particular individual needs. Is there a way of designing the thing that means that everyone could access it? So yeah, recognize exclusion, learn from diversity, solve for one, and extend to many. Okay, third thing, which is probably the most important thing we discovered, is that the need for co-production, right? So if every school has to produce a kind of inclusion policy, so a way of accommodating these massive differences that exist in the classroom, then that policy needs to be co-produced in a meaningful way by parents, staff, students, and crucially those who are experiencing those differences. This is quite a scary thing because ultimately it means ceding some level of control. But principles are basically assessing needs, building a plan for action, implementing it, monitoring and evaluating. I won't talk more about that because I'm probably light on time. And finally, a neurodiversity-oriented approach can promote a sense of belongingness at school, which as a sort of neuroscientist, I felt was a bit too kind of fuzzy for me, but it was such a strong message from especially those who had lived experience of going through the education system and experiencing, for instance, those cognitive difficulties. Even where the accommodations were put in place, they never really felt like they belonged in school, and that for them, the ultimate goal of any kind of inclusion policy was to feel like they belonged in school. So evaluations of high exclusion rates show that when people's needs aren't met, that's when they tend to drift away from the school system. A neurodiversity-based approach, like the LEANS curriculum that I showed a moment ago, can shift those attitudes, and that ultimately this can foster a greater sense of belonging. Which brings me to this, which is to say that we're currently now working on the outputs, which are many from the workshop, and we are building a pack of resources that schools can use to try and deliver local or co-produce local inclusion policies that work in their particular local context. And if you scan this QR code, it should take you to an autocomplete email that will add you to our subscribed mailing list, which means that you'll be not missing out when we get those things finished and we launch them in September. Okay, so what did we learn? So attempts to fix cognitive differences have so far had pretty poor results, in my view. Around 1.4 million kids in England have additional needs that require that we make schools inclusive. We can, according to our workshop, we can do this by shifting attitudes about differences, moving inclusion to inclusion by design rather than on demand. The plans need to be local and co-produced. And the end goal is to make a place where children feel that they belong. So hopefully I've introduced the idea that cognition varies a lot in kids at school. There are other differences that are important too, which we can talk about more later. This is an entirely natural consequence of brain development. It is not a bug, it is a feature of us as a species. And so we need to make sure that schools are an inclusive place that can accommodate these kinds of differences. It's really the overwhelming message that we got from our workshop. If you want to find more about our research, you can visit our lab page. Big thanks to the lab, especially collaborators who help us a lot with the modeling as well, and the people who collected this amazing CALM data set. And I'll finish by showing you those QR codes in case you want any of those resources. Thank you all very much.
So, Duncan, what did you feel of the day then?
I really enjoyed it. It's always fun to come and meet with teachers and school leaders, not just to share with them about the kind of research that we're doing, but really to hear from them about their practical experience of what it's like being a teacher on the ground, dealing with the various kind of constraints that they have, the various things that they have to achieve in the classroom, and thinking about when neuroscience fits in with all of that. So it's been a really enjoyable day. One of my favorite parts was when we discussed if we were to redo teacher training and education, what would it look like? And trying to marry together kind of what bits of science would we feel like is a must?
Yeah.
Not just from neuroscience, but from all sorts of other kind of branches of science, but also then hearing from teachers and those who train teachers to hear about what's practically deliverable, what's useful. For example, giving teachers insight into the local context that they're likely to be working with and what might they expect when they arrive in the classroom. Having the opportunity to sit back and think, you know what, if we were to design teacher training right from scratch, what would it look like? Was a really enjoyable exercise.
So were they suggesting that each school had some sort of context and the community around had some sort of context, and that needs to be fed in as well?
So it's the challenge is how you would marry up a kind of central curriculum for all teachers with making it useful on a local context. So for example, you can't bake into it, this is what you should expect in a classroom, because if your school's in a different type of community, in a different kind of scenario, that's not going to work. So what instead should be in the curriculum is something more broad about principles, about what kinds of things is it worth knowing about your local context, and depending on what that is, how should that shape your practice. I think those conversations are already starting.
Okay.
And certainly having the more continual engagement with those who are likely to be in a position to bring about change, rather than waiting until we think there's a moment for them to deliver that change, is important. And I think those sorts of dialogues are already happening. So for instance, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Education, for instance, are already having those kinds of discussions.
Do we want to just continue to have these sort of multidisciplinary sessions?
I think there's a few directions that we can and should go in. I think one direction is to identify what schools are already required to deliver, but that there is a gap in terms of the evidence base and the resources that they can draw upon. So for example, schools are already required to provide CPD, continuing professional development, but they're given minimal information about what that should look like and how they should structure it and what kind of resources they could draw upon. I think that would be a great space for learners to work in. They're already required, for instance, to have a local inclusion policy such that all children can access education. Again, that's another space where having information about neuroscience and diversity would be really, really useful. And again, I think that's an area where there are not many resources available to schools, so that it would be a great space for an organisation like Learnus to work. So my feeling is to identify areas where schools are already required to be doing something and providing schools with a kind of ready set of resources that they can use to do that.
So our final keynote this afternoon is being delivered by Peter Mather, Head of Training and Development, Teach First Advanced Mentor at Greenford High School, Jeremy Dudman-Jones, Assistant Head Teacher at Greenford High School, and Cara Carey, Developmental Lead, Teach First Programme Support. And this is actually going to be about delivering the early careers framework. Thank you.
I work with Jeremy at Greenford High School. So it's right on the edge of West London. We're in Ealing. We've got 2,000 pupils and about 200 staff, of which 140 are teachers. Cara is our development lead with Teach First, but is very much part of the Greenford family, coming in and supporting our Teach First and mentors and so on. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a little bit about what the Early Career Framework is. And this is started in September 2021, a 2-year programme for what's called early career teachers. And this name replaced what used to be called newly qualified teachers, and that was a 1-year induction. And really, I put the Department of Education there, this was in response to a recruitment crisis. So the idea was to have maybe a 2-year programme of professional development that would help retain teachers in the future. So what Cara's going to do now is talk about the early career framework from Teach First point of view. that we use as our provider. I'll then come back and talk about ECT induction in school, and then Jeremy will talk about how we deliver educational neuroscience training to our staff.
As Peter said, I'm a development lead at Teach First, so I work with a variety of different teachers in their sort of beginner and early career. And as we've just been hearing, all schools in England now must ensure that their early careers teachers, that's their teachers in their first 2 years, have access to the early careers framework. Schools can choose to do this through working with one of 6 lead providers, or use accredited resources, or design their own provision. So Teach First are one of 6 lead providers. There are other providers available. But we have around 11,000 ECTs currently on our ECF programme. As a charity, we have a mission of making a fairer society, and do this by addressing educational disadvantage. So we work specifically with schools facing the biggest challenges in some of our communities facing the most disadvantage. And this is actually sort of one of the threads that we try to incorporate through our early careers framework, and how to best serve those communities. We also have a variety of other teaching and leadership programs, but today I'm just going to focus on the early careers framework. So we've seen this slide a few times now. We have our team of curriculum designers, and they start by taking the statements from the early careers framework. I think we've all chosen to look at this element of the careers framework in particular, because it's the one that has the most links to neuroscience. And we can see that it's got the Learn That statements informed by educational research, and then the Learn How-Tos, which we were talking about, are more practical applications, and they're taken from a wider research base, including speaking to experts within the field. It also, within all the, for each standard within the early careers framework, there's these reference lists, which are then used to sort of try to incorporate that into our curriculum. So this is just one little bit of it. And all of the parts of the early careers framework have direct links to each of the 8 teacher standards, which all teachers must be adhering to throughout their career. We've got another lovely matrix here. So as with the core content framework, the early careers framework is not a curriculum on its own. And as we heard about from Bath Spa and from Bristol, we have some scope to add some further detail or further research to that, and opportunities to sort of embed it and contextualize it and sequence it into a curriculum that works for our communities. To do this, we've worked with subject experts such as the EEF to sort of develop what we have as the starting point of the statements from the ECF into our curriculum. And then our curriculum designers consider how that should be mapped out against the 2 years. So this is what we're starting to see here. We've got a big document where all the statements from the ECF are mapped out, and our curriculum designers look at which point in the modules of our delivery we're going to cover these, and then crucially when we're going to come back to them, and making sure that we've got that repetition there. We also have quite a lot of scope at the moment for the mentor curriculum. So every single ECT in school will have a mentor that supports them throughout their 2 years, and there is training provision for those mentors. We have designed a curriculum for the mentors as well, and there we can look at partly what is in the ECF and how they can support their trainees, but we can also look at different things about how to support the trainees' well-being, and particularly things around how to engage with research so that the mentors themselves can become sort of critical users of research and consider what is best practice and what will work in their school's context. We have 2 delivery models. So my development lead colleagues and I will deliver the curriculum that's been designed to ECTs and their mentors through 2 pathways. So we have a direct delivery model where Teach First employees deliver our seminars and the ECTs engage with those and with some online self-study resources. But we also work with a number of delivery partners for our indirect delivery. And here we run train the trainer sessions. I'm on this team, and so I will run sessions for the facilitators in our delivery partners, and those are teaching school hubs or academies, and then those facilitators will be the ones who actually deliver to the ECTs and the mentors. So in these sessions, we can then focus on other things such as, firstly, making sure that the facilitators are really confident in the content themselves and are able to deliver it in a way that feels natural, but also how to support the ECTs and the mentors in really engaging in that content and processing it and making sure that they can apply it in their context and have the time to consider that. And we do that particularly sort of looking at how to best facilitate in an online setting, as that's how quite a few of our partners will deliver because they're not all in one place at the same time. So we are incorporating cognitive science in a variety of ways within our provision of the ECF. So firstly, in the way that we're designing the curriculum, sequenced with the benefits of retrieval practice in mind. The self-study materials will be recapped and built on in the live seminars, often through a sort of a retrieval quiz or asking the ECTs to sort of apply what they've learned in the self-study into their own context as part of the seminar. In our delivery and in our curriculum design, we're thinking about the cognitive load of the ECTs and the mentors and how to present new information. In our work with delivery partners, we'll think about how to effectively deliver the content using strategies such as introducing the new information in chunks, making sure there's enough pause points so the participants can sort of rehearse and embed that information. We also think about how to make sure that the ECTs are really engaging with the content. As we're delivering online, this can sometimes be a bit tricky as you don't have that sort of receptive, that sort of immediate response. So we think about sort of how we can increase their thinking ratio by using multiple choice questions, getting them to annotate on slides. And then there's lots and lots of, within our curriculum, there's lots of opportunities for the ECTs and the mentors to consider specifically how to incorporate what they've learned in practice. In year 2, unique to the Teach First curriculum, the ECTs are taught in subject and phase groups. So all the examples that we are using of sort of the research are given in subject-specific or phase-specific contexts. And then across both years, the seminars and the self-directed study are linked to a mentor focus or a mentor interaction. And that's where the ECTs can work with their mentor to really apply their learning from the seminars and from the self-directed content into their subject and their particular school context. That is a quick overview of sort of the bigger picture. Now I'm going to hand over to Peter, who will go over what this looks like on a school level. Okay, so the Early Career Framework at Greenford High School. I'm really pleased to say our 10 early career teachers in their second year have just completed a satisfactory 2-year induction period. So they're all fully qualified teachers now, which is excellent. We started following the Early Career Framework actually a year early. We were part of an early rollout phase. This was something put in place by Teach First initially for certain UK regions, but because of COVID, they offered it
to our NQTs who were having to do a lot of training online and at home. So we had NQTs who did part of the ECF in the 2020 to 21 academic year. And they enjoyed that. I enjoyed the materials I saw. So it was really a good choice to go with Teach First. And we went with Teach First as our lead provider because of our long history. We've had Teach First trainees in our school since 2010. We host something called School-Centred Learning and have done for about 6 years. This is where, so the current cohort of Teach First have just started what's called their Summer Institute. And as part of that, they have lots of theory, university-based sessions, but they go into school for a few days and they do their first bits of lesson practice, which they then take back to the theory aspect of their Summer Institute. So this year, we will have in our current cohort in 2023, our 50th Teach First participant joining us. We're all been successfully trained, and we've got several with us in senior positions. So I'm really pleased to say about that. It's slightly different with Teach First, because Teach First do 1 year as a sort of initial teacher training program in school, then they start the early career framework in their year 2. So actually they have 3 years of training with us in school, just to make that clear. This is what our induction program looks like. On the 1st of July, we usually employ our early career teachers, and they have school induction then. They have a couple of weeks with us, getting to know the students and their classes, ready for teaching in September. We also have sessions that will take place with early career teachers and mentors, training them about the process. Jeremy also delivers educational neuroscience, as I said earlier in the talk, but he's going to focus a little bit more on mentors and how we encourage mentors who may not be others had the same sort of experience of the educational neuroscience as part of the ECF. And then we have half-termly meetings. We used to have with NQTs weekly meetings in school and would deliver sessions. Because of the early career framework, we sort of get together and have a catch-up with what they've learned, and then we incorporate that with particular school policies and practice. Each week, early career teachers and mentors have weekly meetings. Early career teachers have a 10% reduction in timetable in their first year in order to do CPD. Mentors also get an extra period as part of this 2-year process. So they meet together, and hopefully in that meeting, they discuss the early career framework content, and they work on how they were going to use the assignments, the quizzes they've looked at, and how that will impact on their classroom practice. I was really pleased that Michael said earlier about being optimistic. We've got the How Pupils Learn that many people have mentioned, and about how that fits in with Learnus and educational neuroscience. But you can see here, this is just one half-term module out of the 6 half-term modules that the early career framework follows in the first year. So each of these will involve 2 seminars, which are online, and they will do content, which is usually between 4 and 7 hours, and that could take the form of readings, videos, all online, that they are expected to do. So in school, they have a face-to-face introduction, 1 seminar at the beginning of the year that they all go to, and as I said, they do 1 hour a week in terms of online content and working their way through, and they have 2 online seminars each half term per module. So this first column is just a screenshot of the first module of year 1. And that shows they've got the sort of summary, they've got objectives, content, assignments, they've got quizzes. And this is myself as a sort of ECT lead or ECF lead would check that and as a sort of auditor to make sure that our early career teachers are on track. Then in the second year, as Cara said, there's a sort of initial retrieval activity where they go back and revisit what they learnt in year 1, and then they go into their first development cycle. And this is subject or phase specific. Good thing about this, for learners I suppose, is that as part of that, they have optional leadership modules, so they can delve into different sessions that interest them a little bit more. One of them could be research in the classroom, which would fit in with what some of you said today. Then, Learnus at Greenford High School. These are just a few of the things that Jeremy does in terms of in-school training to our students, staff, to our parents, to our PTCE cohort when they come into school. As I said before, it was a very popular part of our newly qualified teacher induction programme, and this continues with the early career teachers. But Jeremy also does external training in terms of conferences, school visits, and primary, secondary, universities, and so on. So he's going to talk a little bit now about what he does.
Sounds like I do a lot, actually. Quite impressed. Yeah, that's pretty good. Right, bit of interactive stuff. Here we go. What do you see it as? Come on, we've all done this, haven't we? That is definitely white and gold, although you can't really see it there, but white and gold. Hands up if you agree with me, white and gold. I love doing it in a big audience. Now, everyone look around at the number of people that haven't put their hands up. Interesting. Good. Because actually, it isn't white and gold. You know the story. You probably heard the story. The story is basically a daughter took a photo of the dress she was going to wear to a wedding and sent it to her mum, and her mum looked at it and said, "You cannot wear white and gold at a wedding. You're going to upstage the bride." And the daughter contacted the mum and said, "It's not white and gold. What are you looking at?" It is, in fact, black and blue. So how many people saw it as black and blue? Okay, so you people are correct. You are the correct ones. Those of you that saw it as white and gold, which I do, and I would bet my house on it. I don't know why I'm going quite close to here. Quite like that. Take one off and sing into it. White and gold, I suppose it's all about perception, isn't it? And how the brain does perceive things. What's that? My little starter dragging you into whatever it is that I then choose to do. So I do these presentations, basically, a lot of them in school. I do all of my sixth formers. I run the sixth form as well, so every single year 12 and year 13 student has me talking about the brain. I do it to all of the new teachers into the school. They have to know about the brain, and I do it to all of the early ECT teachers. Anyone that's new that comes into school, they get this. Even my team, the cleaners and the caretakers, they get a bit. We do a lot of it. I also offer it to parents. I go to primary schools and offer something slightly different, and it's a bit of a plug here. Excuse me, if anybody wants to go through the Learnus, you can book me. So I talk about stuff about the teenage brain, and one of the reasons I do stuff about the teenage brain, what goes on under the bonnet, is because I used to do some talks at the Institute of Education, and too many teachers said to me, "I don't really care about what goes on under the bonnet as long as I can drive the car." And I thought, well, that's a bit of a shame, actually. It's a real pity that you are spending your time connecting with brains and you don't really want to know how they work. So what I did was put together some things that I thought were quite important about the brain, hence why I call it Stuff About the Brain. And it's just sort of the basics, the basics. And once you've got the basics, maybe you go off and you can use that stuff and inform your teaching or your learning. So loads of things that we talk about. We do the basic stuff first of all, but I have honed in on which I sort of refer to as the 3 stools for school. Synaptic pruning, plasticity, and brain maturation, they all come together, and it's sort of that idea of neurons and how they change and how they stay together and why they stay together and why they don't stay together and what happens when they don't stay together, and how Duncan was talking about cost. Biologically, it's quite important that you understand to retain a memory requires, a lot of protein and a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of energy, a lot of minerals, et cetera, et cetera. Why on earth would a teenage brain want to retain something like that if it wasn't going to be useful to it? So if you talk about those sorts of things to teachers and to students, they start to build up an understanding, I suppose, of why it is that the brain doesn't remember certain things and does remember other things. Circadian rhythms, so sleep for me is incredibly important. We talk about consolidation of information. Well, you're not going to consolidate very much if you don't get sleep. And I don't know if you're aware, but teenagers, they have a sort of lagged sleep cycle. Their circadian rhythm is slightly out. It's all about melatonin and adenosine. I think it's adenosine. And they get tired a little bit later than parents do. So parents want to go to bed and are moaning at the teenagers go to bed, and the teenagers aren't tired. And then in the morning, the parents wake up, and the teenagers don't want to wake up because they've went to bed an hour later. And schools in this country are geared towards parents, not really geared towards the teenagers in particular. Now, that's not the case for primary school students. So the primary school students' brains are similar to parents' brains. All of that sort of stuff unearths interesting conversations that we often have. And finally, drugs. We all like drugs? Yes? How's that if you like drugs? You know you do. Ashley, drug of choice, what is it? Merlot. It's a Merlot, isn't it? Yeah, creme de menthe, seriously. But the neurotransmitters, the importance of dopamine, the importance of serotonin, the misunderstanding of dopamine and what it is or isn't. The importance of serotonin, for me, the importance of oxytocin, especially PE teachers are very good with the old huggy, teamworky thing. Oxytocin, there's so much interesting stuff about oxytocin as well. So that's what, we always do that, don't we? I mean, that is learning, isn't it? This is the newborn babies over there, because this pointer doesn't particularly work, but that one on the far side, that's the newborn baby. And this is the baby after 6 months. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Born with the same number of cells, neurons, and all of those new connections are being made. And that's what learning is. That is what learning is. So this becomes quite an important sort of image for me. The other thing that I am doing now is talking a little bit about, I should have too many of these up there, but you might have heard Paul was talking about heuristics and the sort of psychology of stuff. All of these I talked to the senior leadership team about. The halo effect. What is it? Innate causality, cognitive load, confirmation bias, loss aversion, etc., all of that sort of stuff, actually, from a psychological point of view, is really quite interesting for leaders and team leaders and middle leaders and members of the SLT. So there's another little session that I do on that one, which is specifically geared towards leadership. And then finally, the new one, which is sort of Stanislas Dehaene. I noticed that somebody had put up his book, which is How to Learn, which is fantastic. And he actually summarizes all of his findings into 4 sort of pretty straightforward things, actually. They are, of course, you need to be attending. You need to be attentive. And if a student isn't attentive and a member of staff isn't attending to how attentive the students are, you're not going to be engaged in the first place. Then you need this thing called active engagement. How do you get active engagement? Then you need this thing called error feedback. And if things are too simple or things are too complicated, you're just going to switch off. Duncan, you were very good. Brilliant stuff on science there. But in terms of active engagement and error feedback, I'm sure there are a lot of people going, all right, I've switched off now. Not me, obviously. I understood everything. Brilliant. And then, of course, consolidation. So this is really specifically for teachers that have been in the profession for a while. I deliver that one as well. Okay, and then finally, so good teaching requires permanent attention to students' attention. Just one of the slides that we use and talk about and discuss. Cool. That is basically me. It's a sort of I'm not ashamed at all, but it's a bit of a plug. If you want me to come and talk in your schools or your places, I'm quite happy to. I thoroughly enjoy teaching the teachers. I think, hopefully Peter's going to nod, I think they all get an awful lot out of it, and they all enjoy those sessions, as do the parents, as do the students.
All proper conferences have this format, so we're going to force it on you. We now have our principal speakers, and you have another opportunity to ask some questions. Please, if you have any questions, we'll pass round the microphones.
Arising out of all of this, I felt confused in a nice way, and I felt the practice was much more all over the place than I had hitherto realised. And I felt also that from some particular lectures that things were much more deterministic than I'd realised, that neuroscience identified things which broadly were not going to change very much, that there are ways you could mitigate against them, and that if you were socially advantaged, you could mitigate somewhat more, but they were fixed. And I got rather excited by the idea of neuroplasticity. I thought that was a lovely word, and I liked the idea of the reality. But am I wrong in feeling disabused of my love of this word and its associated ideas?
So is everything determined? No, it's not. For sure, people's environments have a massive role in the way that their brains develop. That's development and plasticity, two related but sort of distinct things. The question is whether when someone arrives at school and they're experiencing cognitive difficulties that make accessing the curriculum challenging, are you as a teacher going to be able to fix those cognitive difficulties? And I think at the minute I would say probably not. And the skill, I'm not a teacher, but I can imagine the skill in being a great teacher is finding ways to make sure that kid can still access the education in spite of the cognitive difficulties they're experiencing. And the best intervention for changing someone's cognition and their brain is education. And that, in a way, is a kind of grand intervention that we as a society have decided that every child should experience. So definitely not the case that it's all determined. The environment is crucially important. I just think that it's the case that if you have a child that's experiencing cognitive difficulties, as a teacher, I don't think your efforts should be around kind of fixing that. I think that the skill is about making sure they can still access their education, because that's the ultimate intervention for kids.
So just to back up what Duncan says, the meta-analysis says you get between 1 and 5 extra IQ points for every year you spend in education. So I think that there's sometimes a sort of paradox there about the differences between kids and plasticity. So the main message is the brain is always plastic throughout your whole life. Your brain's plastic now, otherwise you walk out here and remember nothing about what just happened. So your brains are always plastic and they can always respond. But I think we need to draw a distinction between how we're all doing versus the differences between us. And it's a slightly different thing about taking advantage of everyone's brain plasticity to improve the average performance versus changing the gaps between individuals. So, and that kind of matters if you're sitting over the road in the Department for Education. If you want to change your education system so that England is doing better than France in maths, in the PISA scores, that's not too hard to do. To move the average or mean population performance, you just double the number of maths lessons. All right, something else is going to have to give. Okay, we'll do less sport or something, less other activities, less art or less science, whatever. But that's moving the whole population. It's another thing to change the differences between kids. And then, as Duncan talked about, part of those differences are genetic, part of those are environmental. How do governments alter policies, or how do we change educational practices to change the gaps between the kids? That seems to be a harder question that we're all struggling to understand. Part of that is to understand learning mechanisms and how they differ across individuals. But the brain is always plastic, and anyone at any point can always improve, taking advantage of that plasticity.
The science of the understanding advantage, understanding the role of family cultures, of grouping cultures, the role of media. There was a completely fascinating thing on YouTube recently which had an audio-only discussion between a teacher and what was clearly, from the voices, a group of early teens about what constituted sex and gender. And you thought there was the teacher saying the quote-unquote right thing, that there are lots and lots of genders, And there were these 13-year-old girls saying what might be called broadly the Daily Mail view of gender, and there was no meeting of minds at all. So the influence on understanding education preparedness to take things on board, I think is very much mediated by media as well.
Yeah, I would be interested in thoughts about, especially given the amount of discussion about individual differences and variability, about the future and whether we're looking at personalised learning becoming more of a thing, and whether technology is friend or foe in the classroom.
I'm feeling quite optimistic. I have been in education for a long time. I am optimistic about the understanding of brain stuff. I'm a bit disappointed about the number of people that want to come into the profession. That is a bit of a problem. I do feel we need a bit more leadership, I suppose, over exactly what we mean by education and what is it that we want to achieve, I suppose. I was fascinated by what Duncan was sort of hopefully saying, I suppose, about the diversity. And maybe a comment about, do we need them all in an institution from 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock, or can we come up with alternative ways using technology? We had a bit of a discussion on this table about whether or not homeschool was acceptable and whether or not education should allow some neurodiverse people to say, well, actually, I didn't really want to go to school and I'm perfectly capable of doing this at home using technology. So I suppose we need those sorts of discussions more. Does there need to be a bit more funding? I suspect there does need to be a bit more funding, but I think on the whole I'm pretty optimistic. I do feel that there is a recruitment crisis, and I do feel that we're not attracting enough really talented people into the profession, sadly. But I think those sorts of things go in cycles, and I'm sure we'll get back to employing a few better people. But what do we want from education, I suppose, is a really important question.
A bit about technology, friend or foe? So I was contacted by an online magazine, which was a parent resource about ChatGPT, and was this going to be a force for like bad because it's going to make all the kids lazy, that they can just press essay button and the essay comes out, so they don't need to write their own essays, and that won't force them to think and they won't learn. I'm generally pro-technology. So I thought things were much worse before they invented books, for example. So there are societal things about regulating content and appropriateness of content, and making sure that the technology is used in the right way to support learning activities, and video game playing doesn't displace sleep and homework and these kind of things. But some of the technology I observe in my own kids, which is self-initiated, about how they will self-skill by using a combination of downloading bits of software, figuring them out for themselves by trial and error, going onto YouTube and finding tutorial videos and teaching themselves in this form of kind of self-regulated learning and self-initiated learning. Now, admittedly, that is not for education relevant skills, it's for editing YouTube videos, right? But those kinds of, but the facility of technology to support this much more self-guided, proactive kind of model of teaching, which is a long way from the Victorian model of the teacher standing up the front trying to impart facts, but moving to the teacher as kind of curating the learning environment that the child can explore. I think the potential of technology to enable that is very significant.
Thank you for today. Just wanted to ask something that we've been talking about at the table, probably I've been banging on about too much, in terms of an impact on learning behaviours and outcomes. How big an element is educating children about the brain? And you talked about it in secondary school, but in primary school, how the brain works. You know, if I've got ADHD, what is happening in my brain at that moment? Why is that stopping me from learning? Actually having dedicated lessons on how the brain works and neuroscience, how much of an impact do you think that can have and should have in terms of disseminating research amongst education and improving outcomes ultimately.
Part of what the Leans program that I mentioned does in primary schools is precisely that. It's trying to get everyone in the class to learn about the fact that everybody's brains are different, there is no right way of being, and that everybody has an equal right to access an education. And that setting up that kind of expectation of diversity from the fundamental science, of course, working with primary school kids, it all has to be really carefully contextualized. There's lots of really great stories about these fictional characters, which means that they can introduce concepts and ideas and experiences. And the early evidence from those sorts of programs is that changing the expectations of kids about what the differences are between all of us and what they can expect to encounter does really foster a sense of belonging. It reduces bullying. It normalizes the idea that some kids are going to need more breaks than someone else, and that's just part of what they need so that they can learn. So I think and there is like bits of neuroscience in there to kind of ground it, but I think in that context it really helps create the expectations of what kids can expect to find in schools, and I think that's really important.
I think it's vital that we talk to the teachers and the young people about what's happening to their brains. Yeah, I think they need to be empowered and given that information. I probably will need to defer to the experts as to the amount we give them and I suppose the quantity that we give them, but I think it's really important that they understand that these changes occur and are going to occur. And I think you need the same sort of conversations with teenagers. They are going through interesting changes, and those interesting changes we've all been through and others will go through them. I think staff need to know that, and I think the young people need to know that.
There's also some really useful resources for this. So the Education Endowment Foundation have a report on metacognition and self-regulation, which you might have seen, and that has recommendations for school as to how we can implement that and support students in understanding how they are learning, and then impacting on their outcomes. And also the learning scientists have they have a website that if you Google the learning scientists, we use some of their resources in our teacher education programs, but actually most of them are designed for students with the idea of this is how you learn best, particularly around revision and trying to get students to understand the sort of most effective techniques of learning.
I gave a talk on how the brain works to 6-year-olds. There's about 50 of them in the room. I think I was the toughest audience ever had. And one of the toughest questions was, is it okay to put your finger in your ear? That's a tough one.
I've just been reading through all of my notes. I found today absolutely fascinating. I'm not a teacher, but I'm just so thirsty to hear more about sort of how teacher training works and what it's like in the classroom. So this may be a naive question for those who are teachers or know a lot more about teaching, but in the first talk, we heard about the YouGov poll that Learnus had commissioned, and that workload was one of the sort of priorities for the teaching profession. And then we've heard later on about diversity and how, well, if I'm assuming correctly, it's, one size does not fit all. So how does that work in terms of the training? So how do you kind of fit that understanding of that teachers need to be flexible in their planning, and in a classroom they can't just do the same for every child? How does that work in a practical sense?
So I think, and this links back to a previous question as well, what we are trying to aim for is what is known as quality first teaching, and our first line of intervention is actually making sure that our teaching is of the highest quality that it can be. And that's through being influenced by current best practice, by the latest evidence, but the things that work for students with additional needs also work for everybody. So that's our sort of first point of call, and then we look at sort of things like, right, now we're assessing. So is that working? Are the students understanding? Right, maybe this student isn't yet. What do I need to do with that particular student? And then you can sort of start a cycle of assessing their needs, planning an action, evaluating that, and sort of tweaking it for individual students. But it all starts from high quality teaching for everybody.
I realised during the day we keep touching on this issue just fleetingly about teacher shortages or the crisis in teacher recruitment. And I realised, so one thing about Teach First, it'd be really interesting to know if this is how you see it, but for me, I sort of see it as partly a way to raise the status of the teaching profession, because it's something that my ambitious students want to go into to do. And so I was wondering whether incorporating educational neuroscience into initial teacher training is another way to potentially raise the view of teaching, and thinking of it in terms of learning science, whether that's something that could potentially help in terms of attracting our best graduates to the profession.
Yes, and I think it's a really important point, and I think it's I don't think it's just Teach First trying to sort of be sort of trying to raise the status of the profession on our own, definitely, but it is something that sort of as an entire sort of field we do want to, and I think this goes back to what Michael was saying at the beginning about having that academic side of it, and like you're talking about sort of having that neuroscience. I think that is one key way that we can raise the sort of status. Other ways would be more funding and higher teacher salaries, but I think it's definitely something that needs addressing, probably through a variety of measures, to make sure that we keep having that we are recruiting more teachers, because there's a huge crisis at the moment. But we do try to make our program really rigorous, and one of the things that we do is we offer, it's a 2-year program, so the trainees complete a PGDE, which is 2/3 of the master's qualification, and then can complete a sort of the extra credits in their 3rd year after the program, to try to increase the numbers of teachers that have that level of qualification.
Yes, I would agree with that comment, really. In terms of would it help recruitment, I suspect it would be swings and roundabouts, and you would gain some people and lose others, would be my best guess. But that doesn't mean it isn't the right thing to do. I think it definitely is the right thing to do as part of establishing this idea that to teach has a really complex, involved base of knowledge and skills. It's that really difficult combination of some technical knowledge, some craft knowledge, that professional situated knowledge. It's bringing all of that together, and it's a complex, very skilled undertaking. So I would really like to see that recognised.
Could I return to the notion of brain plasticity, and also introduce into this our increasing understanding of the fundamental changes experienced by adolescents. This is the context for my question, which I'm going to try and make as open as possible. Could you share with me your perspective on high-stakes testing? Bearing in mind brain plasticity, fundamental changes in the brain during adolescence. What are your views on high-stakes testing within that context?
I think any sort of testing, so Julie comes into Greenford and is doing some research in school, and from my perspective, obviously her research is confidential and anonymous, but a couple of the students who have been to see her have really enjoyed that experience, and I think anything that makes students enjoy school is a good thing, and I think having researchers in school doing any sort of work is only a good thing for us as teachers and as staff, and to promote the more academic side, I suppose. So that's my view.
But I guess the point was, what impact does high-stakes testing have on pupils' development?
I think hopefully positive.
Duncan, do you want?
I think that
education's sort of under-resourced and over-tested. And my strong feeling, something we learned a lot about on the workshop that we ran, for instance, is that the way that we assess knowledge is often so restrictive and it doesn't provide enough alternative ways of people showing what they know. And I'm not a teacher, but in my own personal view, I would like to see us moving away from a model of high-stakes exams set during vulnerable periods of development and towards alternative means of assessments that are more varied, that give students more variable ways of demonstrating their knowledge, and that have a timing such that they're less stressful. I think that would be a good thing.
How would that look? At the moment, we have these wonderful young people who are bundles of joy and energy and confusion. They're having to make huge decisions when their brains are going through such fundamental changes. How can we assess that, their learning? It seems that GCSEs may well be, I'm a marker, by the way, for OCR. Those GCSEs, are they actually assessing what we want to assess? If they're not, what measures can we put in place to ensure that we're fair to these wonderful students?
Yeah, there'll be education experts who will know way better than me to kind of answer that question. But one suggestion, I think what we're assessing is how someone performs in a particular scenario on a given day. And I think that there are alternative ways of assessing performance. For instance, something that's more continuous, a portfolio of work. And I think my suggestion would be to think along those lines rather than an exam on a particular day. Others will know better than me.
We should certainly think really carefully about GCSEs, the purpose of them, and A-levels. We talked about on our table the increasing anxiety amongst students, and A-levels in particular. Basically, ratchet that up and put it, multiply it by a lot. I think we really do need to reconsider the high stakes testing.
I would say my question sort of links onto that. I think there's a lot of connectivity between what we I'm a head teacher, between what we know works in practice and what the neuroscience proves works in practice. And that's great, that connection. But then how do we use that evidence base to impact on policy and make real changes in the educational system? There's a small question to end on. Just thinking there might be a new government coming our way at some point. How can we get those people engaged in this?
Really tricky about policymakers, because sometimes I get over-ambitious and say, to a policymaker, I'm to be married to one who works across the road in the Department for Education. And she says, if you're really confident that this technique works and you've got good evidence for it, I'll just go and make it compulsory for all teachers in all schools tomorrow. Is that what you want? And it's like, oh, no, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to give teachers more tools and more options and more autonomy and more expertise. I don't want a prescriptive model. So then I think you have to, from my perspective as a researcher, I have to educate myself more about what levers policymakers have and what is influencing their setting. And I have to bear in mind that the ultimate policymakers are the elected government ministers, and they are democratically elected on a mandate, with a certain manifesto to achieve certain kind of goals, which are kind of wider and sometimes economic and sometimes social. So and that's part of increasing the evidence base on what would be the best way to deliver certain kind of learning outcomes and what are the barriers that are preventing that. But I don't kind of feel it's my place to say what they should be learning, so it's a kind of nuanced debate. But certainly I've been involved in debates where you feel a big political pendulum that swung towards the early years. And through in the early days of educational neuroscience, there was a big focus on, well, we know the brain is pruning its synapses, so we've got to do everything in the first 1,000 days, else most children are doomed. And that was just an overextension of the science. And I ended up not in the Department for Education, but giving evidence to the university's minister. And I could see he'd felt that in the cabinet room, the early years minister had got hold of all the budget on account of the neuroscience. And he thought, I must get me some of them neuroscientists. So she come in and tell me how important adolescence is, and then I can get some of my budget back. So one is aware that one is involved in an ongoing debate. A point that someone said to me the other day is that there's some bias to keep the status quo. It's kind of working, right? But we have to bear in mind that the status quo is actively hurting some of the kids right now.
Yeah.
So we have to think about there is a force for change as well.
Duncan.
Whether it's a policy thing or not, I don't know, but at some point it seems to be really great to have a sort of transparent conversation about what it is that, as a society, we want from an education system. So historically, the education system's been there to train the economic workforce of the future and to put kids somewhere so that their parents can be active economic agents. But over time, hopefully, we've decided that we want our education system to do more than that. Or it has found itself doing way more than that. And I still think lots of the systems and procedures around education are still sort of constructed around that idea that it's about training an economic workforce, when in practice it's doing that, but a whole bunch of other things as well. And it seems to me that that's the conversation that needs to happen, and then to think about, right, so what would the policy be as a result of it? But it seems to me that as a country, we never really stop and think, what is it we actually want from our education system?
Yeah.